What if the gods never left? What if they simply learned to work through different channels, weaving influence through bloodlines and institutions, rather than descending from skyboats in clouds of fire? In the crumbling libraries of ancient Mesopotamia, pressed into clay that has survived 5 millennia, there are texts that don't read like mythology at all. They read like documentation. Precise genealogies, technical specifications, treaties between beings of different origins. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came, and they described them not as distant cosmic forces but as physical entities who walked among humanity, who bred with humans, who ruled from temple platforms and made decisions that shaped the course of civilization itself. But here's what keeps archaeologists awake at night. The texts never describe them leaving. The stories don't end with ascension or departure. They simply transition. The gods step back from direct rule and begin working through intermediaries, through priest kings who carry their bloodlines, through institutions that preserve their knowledge, through patterns of control that feel oddly familiar even now. So before the story pulls you under, take a moment to like this video and hit subscribe, but only if you're drawn to histories that blur the line between mythology and uncomfortable possibility. And if you're still here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I want to imagine this ancient question stretching across the world, connecting us all in the dark. What if they never left? What if they're still here, operating on timescales we can barely comprehend, guiding evolution itself towards some purpose we haven't yet understood? The clay tablets don't speak in metaphor. That's the first thing that strikes you when you read the earliest Sumerian king lists and creation accounts in their original context, stripped of later interpretations and theological overlay. They describe the Anunnaki with the same matter-of-fact precision they used to record grain supplies and land measurements, beings from elsewhere who arrived, who established cities, who interbred with humans and created hybrid bloodlines that would rule for generations. The tablets catalogue their names, their relationships, their territories, their conflicts with each other. They read less like religious texts and more like administrative records from a colonial occupation. When Samuel Noah Kramer first translated these documents in the 1940s, he noted how oddly specific they were, how they resisted easy mythological categorization. The gods had job descriptions, they had family drama, they had political factions, and nowhere in these earliest texts is there a departure scene, a final goodbye, a moment when they left Earth entirely. The Sumerian King List, preserved on tablets like the Weld Blundell Prism dating to approximately 2000 BCE, doesn't read like mythology trying to explain the universe. It reads like a bureaucratic document tracking political succession. Before the flood came over the land, the text states, kingship was lowered from heaven to Eridu. Then it lists rulers, their reigns, and the cities they governed. But here's what makes translators uncomfortable. These rulers, before the flood, supposedly reigned for tens of thousands of years each. Alulim ruled 28,800 years. Al-Aljar ruled 36,000 years. 8 kings spanning 241,200 years total. After the flood, the reigns become shorter but still superhuman. Gradually, across generations, the numbers decrease until they approach normal human lifespans. This isn't the pattern of mythological exaggeration, where ancient heroes get more impressive as stories are retold. This is the pattern of dilution, of something biological gradually weakening through successive generations. The Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest creation texts we possess, describes the situation before civilization with remarkable precision. When the gods, instead of humans, performed the labor, carried the burden, the text explains, the workload of the gods was too great. The excavation was hard, so the gods complained about their servitude. They weren't abstract cosmic forces contemplating existence. They were workers unhappy with their assignment. Enki, described as the god of water and wisdom, sleeps while these complaints reach a crisis point. Ninhursag, referred to in some texts as a birth goddess or genetic specialist, suggests a solution. Let a primitive worker be created. Let him bear the yoke assigned to the gods. The text then describes a process that sounds disturbingly like genetic engineering, mixing the essence of the gods with the clay of the earth, creating something new that combines elements of both. This hybrid creation could understand language, follow complex instructions, and reproduce, creating a self-sustaining workforce. The Atrahasis epic, preserved in versions from both the Old Babylonian period around 1700 BCE and later Assyrian copies, provides even more technical detail about this process. The text describes Enki and Ninhursag working together, slaughtering a god named Wiila who possessed intelligence, mixing his blood and flesh with clay so that god and human would be thoroughly mixed in the clay. The result is humanity as we know it, physical like the earth creatures that existed before, but possessing the intelligence and awareness of the Anunnaki. When workers at the British Museum first translated these passages in the 1860s, they assumed they were reading corrupted mythology. But the texts don't present this as divine mystery. They present it as solved technical problem. The Anunnaki needed workers. They modified existing creatures. They created hybrids. Problem solved. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic composed around 1200 BCE but drawing from much older sources, frames this same process in grander theological language but preserves the essential details. After Tiamat is defeated and order established, Marduk proposes creating humans. I shall compact blood. I shall cause bones to be. I shall make stand a human being. Let human being be its name. I shall create humankind. They shall bear the gods' burden that those may rest. The text explicitly states the purpose: to relieve the gods of work. This wasn't spiritual creation through divine will alone. This was practical genetic engineering to solve a labor shortage. These texts share a consistent narrative across thousands of years and multiple civilizations that inherited and preserved them. The Anunnaki arrived. They needed workers for some project the tablets describe as mining or excavation. Local hominids weren't sufficient. Genetic modification created humans capable of understanding language and following complex instructions. Some texts describe multiple attempts, experiments that produced failures before success. This isn't how mythology typically develops. Myths simplify over time. They become more archetypal, more symbolically pure. These texts do the opposite. They preserve technical details about biological processes across millennia of copying and translation. That suggests the details mattered. That suggests they were describing something real that subsequent generations felt obligated to preserve accurately, even when they no longer fully understood what they were describing. But what haunts scholars who work extensively with these primary sources isn't just what they say, it's what they don't say. There's no departure narrative. The texts transition from describing direct rule by the Anunnaki to describing rule by kings who claim descent from them. But the Anunnaki themselves never leave. They withdraw to temples, appear less frequently to common people, work through intermediaries and hybrid bloodlines, but the tablets continue to describe them as present, as making decisions, as requiring offerings and communication. Inanna's descent to the netherworld, dating to approximately 1900 BCE, describes her traveling between realms that seem to be different physical locations rather than mythological concepts. The Epic of Gilgamesh shows the hero meeting Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, who has been granted immortality and lives in a distant place that requires hazardous journey to reach. These beings didn't transcend to another dimension. They relocated to areas humans couldn't easily access. The administrative tablets from temple archives across Mesopotamia support this reading. They describe ongoing offerings delivered to sanctuaries where the gods supposedly dwelled. They record communications between priests and divine entities. They document appointments of kings who undergo rituals in sealed chambers of temples, emerging with authority described as granted directly by the Anunnaki. This continues for thousands of years. The pattern doesn't end with ancient Sumer. It continues through Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian civilizations. Different cultures, different languages, same underlying structure. Beings called gods, living in restricted areas, communicating through authorized intermediaries, maintaining control through hybrid bloodlines they had established. If you were reading these texts without preconception about what's possible, you wouldn't conclude they left Earth. You'd conclude they changed their operational strategy. Something happened to human evolution approximately 300,000 years ago that geneticists still cannot fully explain. Homo sapiens emerged not gradually but with startling suddenness, possessing cognitive abilities far beyond what natural selection would predict for the timeline involved. Our brains tripled in size in an evolutionary eye blink. We developed complex language, abstract thought, and symbolic reasoning all at once. The Sumerian texts offer an explanation that makes archaeologists uncomfortable. Deliberate genetic modification by the Anunnaki, who needed workers but found existing hominids insufficient for their purposes. The texts describe Enki and Ninhursag conducting experiments, mixing their essence with that of existing humans, creating a hybrid that could understand language and follow complex instructions. Modern genetics has found something peculiar, fragments of DNA in the human genome that appear to have no evolutionary precursor, sequences that seem to have been inserted rather than gradually developed. The timeline itself presents problems. Homo erectus persisted relatively unchanged for nearly 2 million years. Brain size increased slowly, gradually, following predictable evolutionary curves. Then suddenly, in a period spanning perhaps 50,000 years, anatomically modern humans appear with brain capacity 30% larger than their immediate predecessors. That 50,000 years sounds like a long time in human terms, but in evolutionary terms, it's instantaneous. Natural selection doesn't work that fast for complex traits like cognitive architecture. Brain tissue is metabolically expensive. The human brain consumes 20% of the body's energy, while representing only 2% of body mass. Evolution doesn't casually triple the size of the most expensive organ unless there's extreme selective pressure favoring that change. Yet 300,000 years ago, humans faced environmental conditions similar to what Homo erectus had already successfully adapted to. There's no obvious ecological crisis that would suddenly favor much larger brains. More puzzling, all the cognitive abilities that define human consciousness appear together. We don't see gradual development of abstract thinking, then later development of complex grammar, then later development of symbolic reasoning. They all emerge as a package. This is exactly what you'd expect from genetic engineering rather than natural selection. Natural evolution produces incremental changes, each with some immediate survival benefit. Engineered changes can integrate multiple modifications simultaneously because the designer understands the ultimate goal and implements everything needed to achieve it. The Sumerian texts describe exactly this: deliberate modification with specific purpose. Enki and Ninhursag weren't waiting for evolution. They were creating a worker species with particular capabilities. In 1997, researchers at the University of Chicago published findings about HAR1, Human Accelerated Region 1, a segment of DNA that is nearly identical across most vertebrates, but shows extraordinary change in humans. This region shows more evolutionary change in the 6 million years since humans split from chimpanzees than it showed in the previous 300 million years of vertebrate evolution. The changes occurred in a burst, not gradually. HAR1 regulates genes involved in cortex development, the part of the brain responsible for abstract reasoning and language. This region didn't evolve slowly. Something changed it rapidly and recently, in evolutionary terms. The conventional explanation involves unprecedented selective pressure from social complexity. The uncomfortable alternative is that someone modified it deliberately. Then there's FOXP2, the so-called language gene, though it does far more than enable language. The human version differs from the chimpanzee version by just 2 amino acid changes. But those changes are crucial. They affect fine motor control of facial muscles and vocal apparatus, enabling the precise articulations required for complex speech. They also influence neural circuits involved in procedural learning and sequence processing. When researchers introduced human FOXP2 into mice, the mice showed altered vocalization patterns and modified neural development. These 2 tiny changes had cascading effects across multiple systems, as if they were designed to integrate multiple functions. The human version appears in the archaeological record suddenly, coinciding with the emergence of behaviorally modern humans. It didn't gradually improve from ancestral versions. It arrived essentially complete. Most intriguingly, human chromosome 2 shows clear evidence of being a fusion of 2 separate chromosomes that remain distinct in other great apes. At some point in relatively recent evolutionary history, 2 ancestral chromosomes merged into one. You can still see the remnant centromere, the genetic scar tissue where the fusion occurred. Chromosomal fusions are rare and typically catastrophic. They're usually incompatible with reproduction, eliminating themselves from the gene pool immediately. For a fusion to become fixed in a population, every breeding individual would need to carry it. The probability of this happening naturally is functionally 0. But if someone with advanced genetic knowledge wanted to make fundamental changes to human genetics, modifying chromosome number would allow wholesale reorganization of genetic material. You could introduce new sequences, modify regulatory regions, restructure entire gene networks. The fusion point on human chromosome 2 sits near regions involved in brain development and immune function. This wasn't random mutation, fixed by chance. This looks designed. The ancient king lists obsessively track lineage, distinguishing between rulers who descended from the gods and those who did not. These weren't symbolic distinctions. They determined succession rights, legal authority, and access to sacred knowledge. The texts describe specific unions between Anunnaki and humans, producing hybrid offspring with extended lifespans and special abilities. But here's where it becomes unsettling. These bloodline records don't end with ancient Mesopotamia. They continue through Egypt, where pharaohs claimed divine parentage, through Hebrew texts, where the Nephilim appear as offspring of the sons of God and daughters of men, through Greek accounts of demigods and heroes, through royal families across Europe who maintained genealogies tracing back to divine sources. Modern researchers studying mitochondrial DNA have found unexpected genetic bottlenecks in human history, moments when diversity suddenly narrowed, as if a small group with specific genetic traits became disproportionately influential in the breeding population. The Sumerian King List doesn't just record rulers. It specifies which ones descended from divine union and which ones didn't. The earliest kings are described as offspring of the Anunnaki themselves, products of direct unions between these beings and humans. The texts record their names, their divine parentage, and crucially, their lifespans. The pattern is consistent. Those with closer genetic connection to the Anunnaki lived longer, sometimes hundreds of years. As generations passed and divine blood diluted through intermarriage with regular humans, the lifespans shortened. But even in later periods, royal families maintained genealogical records, tracing descent from these original hybrid dynasties. This wasn't religious metaphor, it was legal documentation establishing claim to throne based on biological inheritance. The Egyptian pharaonic tradition maintains identical claims. The Palermo stone, dating to approximately 2500 BCE, records dynasties stretching back before written history, including rulers described as gods who directly governed Egypt. Then came the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, who were hybrid offspring of divine and human parents. Finally came fully human pharaohs who nonetheless maintained divine blood through their lineage. The pharaohs didn't claim to represent the gods metaphorically. They claimed literal descent from unions between divine beings and human women. The elaborate coronation rituals included ceremonies where the pharaoh's divine essence was activated or awakened, as if they carried genetic potential that needed to be triggered through specific processes. The Book of Genesis, chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, describes this same phenomenon in Hebrew tradition. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown." This passage has troubled theologians for millennia because it doesn't fit comfortable religious narratives, but it fits perfectly with the Mesopotamian accounts. Beings from elsewhere breeding with humans, producing hybrid offspring who became famous rulers and warriors. The Greek traditions preserve the same pattern through different cultural lens. Zeus and other Olympians constantly produce demigod offspring through unions with mortal women. These demigods, figures like Heracles, Perseus, Achilles, possess abilities beyond normal humans. Extraordinary strength, extended lifespans, resistance to injury, sometimes limited immortality. Greek mythology presents this as divine philandering, but the underlying structure matches Mesopotamian accounts exactly. Non-human entities producing hybrid offspring who display characteristics of both parents and who often become rulers or founders of important lineages. European royal families continued this obsession with bloodline through the medieval period and beyond. The Merovingian dynasty claimed descent from a sea creature through their legendary founder Merovech. British royalty traced lineage through Welsh kings back to Brutus of Troy, who supposedly descended from Aeneas, who was son of the goddess Venus. Noble families maintained detailed genealogical records, arranged marriages carefully to preserve bloodlines, and enforced laws restricting nobility from marrying commoners. The obsession with blood purity had supposed biological basis. Noble blood was genuinely different, carrying qualities that couldn't be found in common population. Modern historians dismiss this as class prejudice. But what if the medieval nobility were preserving garbled memory of actual genetic differences established millennia earlier? Population genetics reveals something strange. Humanity shows evidence of severe bottlenecks, moments when breeding population crashed to remarkably small numbers. The most recent occurred approximately 70,000 years ago, possibly associated with the Toba supervolcano eruption, when human population may have dropped to as few as 3,000 to 10,000 individuals. But there are other, smaller bottlenecks in the genetic record that don't correspond to known catastrophes. These are moments when genetic diversity suddenly narrows, as if a small group with specific genetic characteristics suddenly became disproportionately represented in the breeding population. This is exactly what you'd see if hybrid bloodlines carrying Anunnaki genetics achieved positions of power and then preferentially bred within their class. Their genetic markers spreading through the population not through random chance but through systematic social advantage. The genetic evidence doesn't prove the ancient texts are literally true, but it doesn't contradict them either. It shows patterns consistent with small groups carrying specific genetic traits, becoming disproportionately influential in human breeding populations at several points in history. The temples weren't just religious centers. The cuneiform tablets make this clear. They were research facilities, knowledge repositories, schools for specialized learning accessible only to select bloodlines. The priests who served there weren't spiritual leaders in the modern sense. They were technicians maintaining systems they had inherited but didn't fully understand. The tablets describe mathematical formulas, astronomical calculations of stunning precision, medical procedures, metallurgical processes, architectural principles that shouldn't have been known for millennia. This wasn't primitive superstition. It was advanced technical knowledge being carefully preserved and selectively shared. The texts indicate this knowledge came from the Anunnaki, taught to certain humans and then restricted to bloodline initiates, who could be trusted not to disseminate it widely. You can still trace this pattern. Secret societies, mystery schools, initiatory traditions that promise access to ancient knowledge, but only after proving worthy through heritage or endurance. The temple complex at Uruk, one of the earliest cities, contained what archaeologists call the White Temple. Constructed around 3200 BCE, but beneath it lie layers of earlier temples stretching back to approximately 4000 BCE, each built atop the ruins of its predecessor. The temples weren't just worship spaces. The archaeological record shows storage facilities for tablets, workshops for bronze working, laboratories for processing medicinal plants, astronomical observation platforms. The tablet collections weren't religious texts primarily. They were technical manuals, mathematical tables, astronomical ephemerides, medical recipes, metallurgical procedures. The priests weren't mystics seeking divine visions. They were specialists, maintaining technical knowledge through careful study and practice. Consider the mathematical sophistication preserved in temple archives. The Babylonians used base 60 mathematics, the same system we still use for time and angular measurement. They calculated square roots using iterative approximation methods that wouldn't be independently rediscovered in Europe until the 16th century. They solved quadratic equations. They computed compound interest. Tablet YBC 7289, held at Yale University, displays a calculation of the square root of 2 accurate to 6 decimal places. This was systematic mathematical knowledge taught through formal training. The priests weren't discovering this mathematics through their own genius. They were preserving it from earlier sources, teaching it to carefully selected students who would continue the preservation chain. The astronomical knowledge was even more impressive. The MUL. APIN tablets, compiled around 1000 BCE, but preserving much older observations, catalogue star positions, planetary movements, eclipse predictions with remarkable precision. They describe the precession of the equinoxes, a phenomenon where Earth's rotational axis slowly wobbles in a cycle, taking 25,772 years to complete. This precession causes the apparent position of stars to shift gradually over centuries. You can't observe this in a single human lifetime. You need centuries of careful measurement and record keeping. Why would ancient priests invest such tremendous effort in tracking celestial phenomena on timescales spanning multiple lifetimes? The tablets suggest they were following instructions, maintaining observation protocols established by the Anunnaki, who needed certain astronomical events monitored across millennia. The medical knowledge preserved in temple archives rivals what wouldn't emerge in Europe until the Renaissance. Tablets describe surgical procedures including cataract operations, tumor removals, setting compound fractures. They catalogue hundreds of medicinal plants with specific applications, preparation methods, and dosage instructions. They describe what we'd now call triage protocols for treating battlefield casualties. This wasn't folk medicine based on trial and error. This was systematic medical knowledge organized into teachable curriculum. The Code of Hammurabi, dating to 1754 BCE, includes detailed fee schedules for various surgical procedures, implying standardized medical training and practice. Priests specializing in healing weren't spiritual faith healers. They were trained medical practitioners using inherited technical knowledge. Metallurgy provides perhaps the clearest example. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, requires specific ratios and processing techniques. Copper ore is relatively common, but tin ore is rare and often distant from copper sources. Yet bronze working appears in Mesopotamia already sophisticated, with minimal experimental phase. The temple workshops produced bronze tools and weapons using techniques that show deep understanding of alloying, heat treatment, and metalworking. Later, iron working emerges with similar suspicious competence. Iron requires much higher temperatures than bronze and more complex processing to remove impurities. Yet when iron working appears in the archaeological record, it's already producing high-quality tools. The metallurgical knowledge preserved in temple workshops wasn't being discovered through gradual experimentation. It was being taught by specialists who had learned from earlier specialists in unbroken chains, stretching back to the Anunnaki, who had supposedly provided this knowledge initially. Access to this knowledge wasn't universal. The tablets describe initiatory systems where students began with basic training and advanced only if they proved both competent and trustworthy. Higher levels of knowledge were restricted to those from appropriate bloodlines or those who had undergone extensive testing. The most secret knowledge was kept in sealed sections of temple libraries, accessible only to high priests who had demonstrated absolute reliability. This created a knowledge hierarchy where crucial technical information remained concentrated in elite hands across generations. If you were establishing a system to preserve advanced knowledge through primitive civilization, this is exactly how you'd structure it. Embed the knowledge in institutions with religious authority, restrict access through initiatory systems, tie highest access to bloodline inheritance to ensure continuity. Create social incentives that make maintaining the system more rewarding than abandoning it. The obsessive astronomical observation of ancient Mesopotamia makes more sense if you understand what they believed they were watching for. The texts describe the Anunnaki coming from somewhere specific in the sky, a place they identified with precision and tracked with intensity that bordered on anxiety. Generation after generation of priests recorded celestial movements, calculating vast cycles that spanned thousands of years. They weren't just creating calendars, they were maintaining a warning system. The tablets speak of periods when the sky path would open again, when those who had left might return, or when those who had stayed might receive reinforcements or instructions from their point of origin. Modern analysis of ancient astronomical texts reveals they were tracking things we only recently understood. Precession of the equinoxes, long-period comets, planetary conjunctions that occur once every several thousand years. Why would a supposedly primitive agricultural society invest such tremendous resources in monitoring cosmic cycles they wouldn't live to see complete, unless they had been instructed to watch, to maintain vigilance across generations, to be ready for something specific that operated on timescales beyond individual human lifespans? The Enuma Anu Enlil, a massive astrological compilation of approximately 70 tablets, records celestial omens and their meanings accumulated over more than 1,000 years of observation. But these weren't superstitious interpretations of random events. The tablets describe systematic monitoring protocols: which stars to observe, when to observe them, what measurements to record, how to calculate future positions. The priests maintained these observations continuously, passing responsibilities from generation to generation, preserving data that wouldn't show its significance for centuries. This level of institutional continuity requires powerful motivation. You don't maintain such systems just for calendar purposes. You maintain them because you believe something crucial depends on this information. The astronomical observatories weren't casual viewing platforms. The Babylonian astronomical diaries, preserved in collections now held at the British Museum, demonstrate observation protocols of scientific rigor. Every night, weather permitting, priests recorded positions of planets, moon phases, unusual celestial events. They noted precisely when planets rose and set, when they achieved certain positions relative to fixed stars, when eclipses occurred. These observations were compiled into tables predicting future planetary positions. The accuracy is startling. Babylonian predictions of lunar positions contain errors of less than 1 degree, requiring observational precision and mathematical sophistication we'd associate with Renaissance astronomy. Why such precision? The tablets suggest specific celestial configurations mattered intensely, that certain alignments or cycles triggered important events or opportunities. The precession of the equinoxes receives particular attention. This phenomenon causes the position where the sun rises on the spring equinox to slowly shift backward through the zodiac, taking approximately 2,160 years to move through each constellation. The complete cycle requires 25,772 years. This isn't observable in human lifetimes. You need multiple centuries of careful observation even to detect it, and millennia to calculate the full cycle. Yet the Babylonian astronomers knew this cycle and tracked it obsessively. The texts describe ages defined by which constellation hosted the equinox sunrise, suggesting these transitions held tremendous significance. Were they marking cosmic time according to some schedule established by the Anunnaki? Were these ages periods when different influences or conditions would prevail, requiring different strategies or preparations? Long-period comets received intense attention. These objects appear rarely, some with orbital periods spanning thousands of years, yet the tablets track them, record their appearances, calculate their returns. The most famous, Halley's Comet with its 75 to 76-year orbit, appears in Babylonian records from at least 687 BCE, but tablets reference other comets with much longer periods. Objects that wouldn't return for generations but whose orbital characteristics were nonetheless preserved. This suggests the priests understood celestial mechanics well enough to calculate orbits, and they considered certain comets significant enough to track across millennia. Were these objects related to the Anunnaki's arrival or movements? Were they monitoring return trajectories? The tablets describe the sky path, sometimes translated as the path of the gods or the ecliptic, with particular intensity. This isn't just the apparent path of the sun through the sky. It's described as a specific route, a highway between locations. The texts suggest the Anunnaki traveled this path when moving between their point of origin and Earth. Certain planetary alignments supposedly opened or marked this route. The priests weren't just tracking planets for agricultural purposes. They were maintaining surveillance on what they believed was a transportation route that might carry beings back to Earth or allow those who had remained to receive support from elsewhere. This transforms astronomical observation from intellectual curiosity into security protocol. Maintain continuous surveillance, watch for specific configurations, be prepared to alert appropriate authorities when critical conditions occur. Archaeology confronts an uncomfortable problem in Sumer. Civilization appears too suddenly and too fully formed. Within a few centuries, nomadic peoples supposedly transitioned from basic agriculture to complex urban societies with sophisticated writing, mathematics, law codes, irrigation systems, monumental architecture, and administrative bureaucracies. There's no gradual development, no experimental phase where they worked out these systems through trial and error. The first cities emerge as if someone already knew exactly how cities should function. The first writing appears already grammatically complex and capable of expressing abstract concepts. The first legal codes display sophisticated understanding of social organization and conflict resolution. The Sumerian texts offer a straightforward explanation. The Anunnaki provided templates, architectural plans, governing structures, technological knowledge. They didn't elevate humans through gradual cultural evolution. They transplanted advanced systems and taught selected individuals how to maintain them. If you were a small group of advanced beings wanting to create a stable civilization that could be managed across centuries while you stepped back from direct rule, this is precisely what you would do. The timeline itself defies conventional archaeological models. Around 3500 BCE, the Ubaid period shows small agricultural settlements scattered across southern Mesopotamia. Simple mud brick structures, basic pottery, subsistence farming. Then within 500 years, by 3000 BCE, you have Uruk, a city covering nearly 250 hectares with a population estimated at 40,000 to 80,000 people. This isn't gradual urban growth. It's explosive emergence of complexity that shouldn't be sustainable. Cities require tremendous coordination, food surplus from agriculture, water management systems, waste disposal, social hierarchies, specialized labor, trade networks, conflict resolution mechanisms. Societies typically develop these capabilities slowly across millennia. Yet Uruk appears with all systems already functioning. The writing system emerges with equal suddenness. The earliest cuneiform tablets from approximately 3200 BCE aren't primitive pictograms struggling to represent simple concepts. They're already using complex grammatical structures, abstract terminology, sophisticated accounting systems. Within a few generations, the writing expresses poetry, legal arguments, philosophical concepts, technical specifications. There's no archaeological evidence of the experimental phase where people worked out how to represent language visually. The system appears essentially complete. This suggests it wasn't invented through trial and error by Sumerian scribes. It was introduced as a complete system and taught to select individuals who then trained others. The mathematical sophistication appears equally sudden. The Sumerians used base 60 mathematics from their earliest records. This system allows complex calculations involving fractions and large numbers far more efficiently than base 10 systems. It's not intuitive. Base 10 develops naturally from counting on fingers. Base 60 requires abstract understanding of number theory and systematic organization. Yet it appears in the earliest Sumerian texts with no simpler precursor. The mathematical tables, the calculation methods, the problem-solving approaches all emerge already sophisticated. This wasn't mathematics being discovered. It was mathematics being taught. Legal systems show the same pattern. The Code of Ur-Nammu, dating to approximately 2100 BCE, is sophisticated jurisprudence, displaying deep understanding of social dynamics, proportional punishment, legal precedent, but it's not presented as innovative legislation. The text describes it as restoration of laws from earlier times, codifying existing practices that supposedly stretched back to the gods themselves. The Code of Hammurabi, from 1754 BCE, is even more complex. 282 laws covering everything from property rights to medical malpractice to building codes. These aren't primitive tribal customs evolving into formal law. These are comprehensive legal frameworks requiring sophisticated understanding of social organization, economic systems, professional standards. The irrigation systems that made Sumerian agriculture possible demonstrate engineering knowledge that seems anachronistic. These weren't simple ditches carrying water to nearby fields. These were vast networks of canals, reservoirs, drainage systems managing water across hundreds of square kilometers. They required precise surveying to maintain proper gradients, understanding of soil permeability, knowledge of seasonal water flow patterns, administrative systems coordinating labor across multiple communities. The engineering calculations, the organizational capacity, the maintenance protocols all appear essentially complete in the earliest archaeological evidence. Someone taught the Sumerians how to build these systems. Someone provided technical knowledge they wouldn't have developed independently in the time frame involved. The Sumerian texts themselves explain this sudden emergence straightforwardly. The Eridu Genesis describes the Anunnaki establishing cities, teaching agriculture, providing laws. The King List begins with kingship being lowered from heaven to Eridu, as if governance was a technology provided rather than organically developed. Enki is credited with teaching mathematics, writing, and the arts of civilization. These aren't mythological origin stories where gods create humans and then leave them to figure things out. These are texts describing active technological transfer, teaching sessions, provision of templates and instructions. If you were advanced beings establishing a managed civilization, you wouldn't wait for humans to slowly invent everything themselves. You'd provide the crucial frameworks, train, select individuals in their operation, and establish institutions to preserve the knowledge across generations. The pattern continues through Mesopotamian history. Each successive civilization, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, inherits and builds upon Sumerian systems rather than developing independent alternatives. The writing system persists with minor modifications. The mathematical system continues unchanged. The legal frameworks expand but maintain the same underlying principles. The urban planning follows similar patterns. This isn't parallel development. This is preservation of inherited systems, maintenance of templates provided at the beginning and considered too fundamental to alter significantly. The knowledge came from somewhere else, was established as foundation, and subsequent cultures understood their role as preservation rather than innovation. The Ziggurats dominate the archaeological landscape of ancient Mesopotamia, massive stepped platforms that consume tremendous resources to construct and maintain. The official explanation frames them as religious structures, literal mountains built so priests could get closer to the gods. But read the administrative tablets, and a different picture emerges. These weren't symbolic. They were functional facilities with specific operational purposes. The texts describe the Anunnaki descending to these platforms, resting there, receiving offerings that sound more like supplies than worship. The platforms had chambers at their peaks that only certain priests could enter, spaces described as dwelling places for the gods when they chose to manifest. Archaeological excavation reveals sophisticated drainage systems, ventilation shafts, and structural features that seem over-engineered for simple ritual spaces. Some researchers have noted the platform's locations correspond to geometric patterns across the landscape, positioned with precision that suggests a network rather than independent structures. Were these landing sites maintained across generations in case the Anunnaki needed them again? Or were they communication facilities, allowing those who remained to stay in contact with those who had departed to other locations? The Ziggurat of Ur, reconstructed by King Ur-Nammu around 2100 BCE, but built atop much older foundations, rises in 3 massive terraces to a height that originally reached approximately 30 meters. The base covers an area of roughly 64 by 46 meters. The core consists of mud brick, but the exterior was faced with baked brick set in bitumen, creating waterproof protection. The structure required millions of bricks. The labor investment was staggering. Why? The official explanation cites religious devotion, but the tablets describe something more practical. The temple at the summit was called the dwelling place of Nana, the moon god, but the term used is more accurately translated as residence or staging area. The texts describe Nana descending to this platform, remaining there for periods, then departing again. This sounds less like worship and more like logistics. The architectural features support this interpretation. The ziggurat at Ur includes drainage weep holes throughout the structure, allowing water to escape and preventing structural damage. This makes sense for longevity but suggests the builders expected the structure to remain functional for extremely long periods. The staircases ascending the ziggurat aren't simple steps. They're massive ramps, capable of moving large objects or supporting processions carrying significant loads. The summit platform included storage facilities, water systems, ventilation shafts. These features exceed requirements for ritual worship space. They suggest the summit needed to support extended occupation or complex operations. More intriguingly, the ziggurats weren't isolated structures. They anchor temple complexes that include workshops, storage facilities, administrative archives, residential quarters for priests. The entire complex functions as integrated facility rather than simple religious center. The tablets describe regular deliveries of specific materials to temple platforms. Precious metals, unusual stones, rare woods, substances we can't always identify from the Sumerian terms. These deliveries are recorded with the precision of supply logistics rather than the language of religious offerings. Quantities are specified, delivery schedules are maintained, recipients are named. This reads like supply chain management for operational facility. The geographic distribution of ziggurats reveals another pattern. They're positioned across Mesopotamia in configurations that some researchers suggest form geometric alignments. The ziggurats at Uruk, Eridu, Nippur, and other major cities, when mapped, create patterns of triangulation. If you were establishing navigation beacons or communication relay stations across a region, you'd position them exactly like this. Distributed coverage, intervisibility where possible, geometric precision. The texts describe communication between cities, messages transmitted through temple systems, coordination of activities across the network. Were the ziggurats nodes in a communication grid? The summit chambers present the greatest mystery. Archaeological excavation reveals these spaces were built to exacting specifications with features that exceed ritual requirements. Some include what appear to be foundation boxes, sealed chambers beneath the floor containing tablets, precious objects, sometimes unusual materials. The chambers have ventilation systems more sophisticated than needed for spaces used only during occasional ceremonies. They include water facilities, drainage systems, storage alcoves. Some researchers have noted anomalous materials in the construction. Stones from distant sources, metals in unusual combinations, substances that required advanced processing. Why include such materials in structures supposedly dedicated to worship? Unless the structures served functions requiring specific material properties, the texts describe these summit chambers as places where the Anunnaki manifested when they chose to interact with humans. Only the highest priests could enter during these manifestations. The protocols were precise. Specific times, specific preparations, specific offerings delivered beforehand. This sounds less like religious ritual and more like scheduled meetings requiring security protocols and advanced logistics. If the Anunnaki maintained presence on Earth but withdrew from general visibility, they would need controlled spaces for communication with human intermediaries. The ziggurats would serve exactly this function. Secure facilities where contact could occur without public exposure, maintained across generations in operational readiness. The distinction between ordinary humans and the ruling class wasn't merely political in ancient Mesopotamia. The texts describe it as biological. Kings claimed descent from the Anunnaki through specific, documented lineages. They underwent initiations in temple sanctuaries that supposedly awakened dormant abilities inherited from their divine ancestors. They possessed extended lifespans recorded in multiple independent sources. They demonstrated knowledge they shouldn't have had access to through normal education. Court records describe them differently than common people, using terminology that emphasized their hybrid nature. They weren't just authorized to rule by the gods. They were presented as extensions of the Anunnaki themselves, carrying genetic material that made them fundamentally different from those they governed. This creates a disturbing possibility. If these hybrid bloodlines were real, they didn't simply vanish when the ancient kingdoms fell. Genetic lines don't disappear. They disperse, migrate, sometimes deliberately preserve themselves through careful marriage strategies. Elite families throughout history have shown peculiar obsession with genealogy and bloodline purity. What if they're not just maintaining social status, but preserving something far more ancient? The coronation rituals reveal the supposed distinction. When a new king assumed power in ancient Mesopotamia, he underwent ceremonies in sealed chambers of the main temple. The texts describe this as awakening or activation of his divine essence. He entered as one thing and emerged as another, recognized as Lugal, literally big man, but also as something translated as shepherd appointed by the gods, or as extension of divine authority. The ritual wasn't symbolic blessing. It was described as transformation activating latent capabilities inherited through bloodline. Court documents thereafter refer to the king using terminology distinguishing him from common humans. He possessed the me, divine attributes or powers that ordinary people lacked. The lifespans recorded for early kings exceed normal human ranges by factors that can't be explained as simple exaggeration. The Sumerian King List records pre-flood rulers reigning for thousands of years, then post-flood rulers with lifespans of several centuries gradually decreasing toward normal ranges. Multiple independent sources confirm the same rulers and similar impossible ages. The easy dismissal claims ancient scribes didn't understand mathematics or were recording metaphorical reigns. But Sumerian mathematical texts demonstrate sophisticated understanding of calculation, and the lifespans show systematic decrease across generations, exactly the pattern you'd expect from genetic dilution. Strong trait from pure bloodlines, gradually weakening as that genetic material disperses through interbreeding with normal human population. The kings demonstrated knowledge that troubled even ancient observers. Sargon of Akkad, ruling around 2300 BCE, supposedly learned to read and write despite being raised by a gardener, unusual for someone outside priestly class. The texts suggest he possessed innate capability exceeding his education. Alexander the Great, much later but claiming descent from Zeus and from Egyptian divine bloodlines through his mother's side, demonstrated strategic genius and physical endurance that amazed contemporaries. He conquered most of the known world before age 33, never lost a battle, survived wounds that killed others. Was this just propaganda, or were certain individuals genuinely different due to genetic inheritance? The marriage strategies of royal families reveal obsession with bloodline that goes beyond normal political alliance. Kings married within narrow ranges of acceptable partners, often sisters or close relatives, patterns that would concentrate genetic traits rather than dispersing them. Egyptian pharaohs particularly practiced sibling marriage, justified religiously but serving to preserve divine bloodline purity. European royalty maintained similar practices, creating networks of interrelated families stretching across the continent. They tracked descent obsessively, maintained genealogical records with religious devotion, enforced laws preventing nobility from marrying commoners. The stated reason was preserving noble blood. But what if that blood actually carried biological differences, established millennia earlier by Anunnaki intervention? Modern genetics has identified something curious in analysis of ancient royal remains. Certain individuals from ruling families show genetic markers suggesting advantageous traits in health, longevity, cognitive function. The sample sizes are small and the analysis remains controversial, but the preliminary findings suggest ruling families may have indeed possessed genetic advantages beyond social privilege. If hybrid bloodlines were established in ancient Mesopotamia through Anunnaki genetic contribution, those advantages wouldn't disappear when civilizations fell. The families would carry the genetics forward, preserving them through careful marriage strategies, maintaining power across millennia, not through conspiracy, but through genuine biological advantage that consistently produced capable individuals who naturally gravitated toward leadership positions. This is what haunts translators who work extensively with Mesopotamian source material. There is no Exodus narrative for the Anunnaki. The texts transition from describing their direct rule to describing their rule through intermediaries, but they never describe them departing Earth. They describe them withdrawing to certain locations, restricting their visibility to the general population, working through priest-kings rather than appearing publicly. That narrative doesn't exist in the primary sources. Later, traditions interpreted their reduced visibility as departure because that made more sense than the alternative. But the Sumerian and Akkadian tablets consistently describe them as still present, still involved, still making decisions that affected human affairs. They describe communication continuing between the visible world and hidden sanctuaries where the Anunnaki supposedly dwelled. They describe offerings still being delivered, protocols still being followed, bloodlines still being monitored. If you were reading these texts without theological preconceptions, you would conclude the Anunnaki simply changed their operational strategy. They stepped back from direct rule into a governance model where they worked through intermediaries, appearing only to select individuals in controlled settings, while the broader population gradually forgot they had ever been physical beings at all. Read through thousands of Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian tablets, and you notice what's missing. There's no great departure scene where the Anunnaki board their skyboats and leave Earth behind. There's no moment where they announce their mission is complete and humanity must proceed alone. The narrative shifts gradually from texts describing the Anunnaki walking among humans, ruling directly from temple platforms, appearing publicly in cities, to texts describing them dwelling in sacred spaces, communicating through priests, manifesting only during specific rituals to authorized individuals. But they're still there. They haven't left. They've withdrawn from general visibility while maintaining control through established systems. The Epic of Gilgamesh, composed around 2000 BCE but drawing from much older sources, shows this transition clearly. Gilgamesh encounters Utnapishtim, the flood survivor granted immortality, living in a distant but still reachable location. Utnapishtim isn't in another dimension or spiritual realm. He's across the waters of death, in a physical place that Gilgamesh reaches through hazardous journey. The Anunnaki aren't transcendent cosmic forces. They're physical beings who've relocated to areas humans can't easily access. The text describes Gilgamesh meeting them, speaking with them, receiving actual physical objects from them. They're still present on Earth, just no longer mingling with general human population. The temple administrative tablets from across Mesopotamian history continue describing active relationship with the Anunnaki. Regular offerings are delivered to temple sanctuaries, not as symbolic gestures but as actual supply logistics. The tablets specify quantities, delivery schedules, distribution instructions. They record messages received from the gods through priests who entered sealed chambers and returned with specific instructions. These communications affected real political decisions, whether to go to war, when to plant crops, whom to appoint to positions, how to resolve disputes. If the Anunnaki had departed entirely, why would successive civilizations across 2,000 years maintain these protocols with such consistency? The coronation ceremonies for new kings included components suggesting the Anunnaki were still available for contact. The new ruler entered the temple's most sacred chamber, the space forbidden to common people and most priests. What happened in that chamber was never described publicly, but the texts indicate direct encounter with divine presence. The king emerged with authority described as granted personally by specific Anunnaki entities, Enlil, Marduk, Ashur, depending on the city and period. This wasn't metaphorical blessing. The texts describe it as actual transmission of authority from physical beings who were present in the chamber when the king entered. Later, Hebrew and Greek traditions misinterpreted this pattern. The Jews, inheriting Mesopotamian concepts through cultural contact and the Babylonian exile, reframed the Anunnaki as angels who had fallen from grace and were imprisoned explaining their reduced visibility as punishment rather than strategic withdrawal. The Greeks described Olympian gods retreating from direct interaction with mortals, but their myths still show these beings interfering in human affairs through indirect means, appearing in disguise, sending messages through oracles, manipulating events from distance. Both traditions preserve the core pattern. Beings who once ruled directly now operate through intermediaries while remaining involved in human affairs. If you were an advanced species managing less developed population, direct rule would be inefficient once basic systems were established. It would require constant visibility, making you vulnerable to populations' unpredictable behavior. Better to establish hybrid bloodlines who could rule in your name, create institutional structures that perpetuate your control automatically, build religious frameworks that make the population self-regulating through internalized obedience to laws you established. Then you could withdraw to secure locations, maintain contact only with highest-level intermediaries, intervene directly only when the system requires adjustment. The population would gradually forget you were ever physically present, interpreting your continued influence as spiritual or mythological rather than recognizing you're still there, operating through the systems you built. The tablets frequently reference libraries, archives, sealed chambers where the most important knowledge was stored away from normal human access. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes the hero seeking ancient tablets that contained knowledge from before the flood, secrets locked in foundations of cedar and lapis lazuli. The texts speak of knowledge sealed in the depths of temples, to be opened only when the proper signs appeared in the heavens or when bearers of certain bloodlines returned. Archaeological discoveries keep confirming these weren't literary inventions. Beneath temple platforms across Mesopotamia, excavators find sealed chambers, buried libraries, caches of tablets deliberately hidden and preserved. The clay would survive millennia. The knowledge would wait. But wait for what? For whom? The texts suggest the Anunnaki created these repositories as insurance, ensuring that crucial information would survive even if civilization collapsed, ready to be accessed by those who knew where to look and possessed the authority to understand what they found. Modern militaries and governments create similar repositories, time capsules, and secured archives designed to preserve critical knowledge across potential dark ages. If you were a long-lived species working on timescales of millennia, you would absolutely create multiple backup systems for crucial information scattered across the landscape and locked with keys that only the appropriate individuals could recognize. The Epic of Gilgamesh preserves tantalizing details about these knowledge repositories. When Gilgamesh returns from his quest, he's described as one who saw the deep, who knew the hidden, who brought back knowledge from before the flood. He supposedly recorded this knowledge on stone tablets and sealed them in the foundations of Uruk's walls, in the copper chest with the iron clasps. The text specifically states future generations should open the chest, unseal the stone, and read the tablets to learn what Gilgamesh discovered. This isn't poetic metaphor. It's literal instruction for accessing stored information. The knowledge was physically preserved, deliberately hidden, with protocols for eventual recovery. Archaeological excavations across Mesopotamia keep confirming the reality of such repositories. At Nippur, excavators discovered over 60,000 tablet fragments in temple library rooms, many deliberately buried beneath floors in sealed deposits. At the royal cemetery contained chambers with tablets sealed in bitumen-lined containers designed for extreme preservation. At Nineveh, Ashurbanipal's library held over 30,000 tablets, systematically organized and stored in protected conditions. The texts reference others, repositories in temple foundations, knowledge sealed beneath ziggurats, tablets hidden in chambers that require specific conditions to access. The texts describe these repositories containing knowledge from before the flood, information preserved across the catastrophe that supposedly reset civilization. If such an event occurred, as geological evidence suggests, massive flooding did devastate Mesopotamia. Preserving crucial knowledge would be essential for rebuilding. The Anunnaki, if they possessed advanced understanding and worked on timescales spanning millennia, would absolutely create multiple backup copies of critical information. They would distribute these archives geographically to avoid single-point failure. They would encode them in material that survives, clay tablets that become harder with age, stone inscriptions that weather slowly, metal objects that resist decay. The access restrictions are equally revealing. Many repositories were sealed with the stipulation they should be opened only when specific conditions were met. Some required astronomical signs, certain planetary alignments, specific eclipses, particular positions of stars. Others required bearers of certain seals or bloodlines, individuals who could prove descent from authorized families. The most restricted knowledge supposedly required both conditions simultaneously: the correct celestial timing and the authorized individual. This creates time-locked system, ensuring knowledge releases only when someone prepared to understand it appears during appropriate historical moment. Modern excavations occasionally find these sealed deposits still intact. When Leonard Woolley excavated Ur in the 1920s, he discovered foundation deposits beneath temple platforms. Tablets, precious objects, unusual materials sealed in containers marked with inscriptions describing their contents as gifts from the gods or as knowledge to be preserved. Similar discoveries continue across Mesopotamia. Many sealed chambers undoubtedly remain undiscovered, buried beneath millennia of accumulated debris, waiting in darkness with their preserved knowledge intact, locked by mechanisms we may not yet understand or by locations we haven't yet identified. If you were managing a civilization across thousands of years, knowing that catastrophes, social collapses, and dark ages would periodically destroy surface knowledge, you would create exactly this type of system. Distribute critical information across multiple physical locations. Encode it in durable materials. Establish protocols for preservation and eventual recovery. Create institutional continuity through religious or initiatory traditions that maintain awareness of the repositories even when the general population forgets. Ensure that when civilization rebuilds after collapse, someone will know where to look and how to access the preserved knowledge, allowing rapid re-establishment of capabilities rather than slow redevelopment from scratch. The Mesopotamian texts describe the Anunnaki not as a unified group but as a complex organization with ranks, territories, specializations, and apparently considerable internal politics. Enlil controlled air and storms and held administrative authority. Enki governed water and possessed scientific knowledge. Ninhursag specialized in genetic work and healing. Inanna controlled aspects of culture and fertility while also demonstrating military prowess. They convened councils. They voted on decisions affecting humanity. They had jurisdictions and respected each other's territories. They formed factions that sometimes came into conflict, using human populations as proxies in their disputes. This doesn't read like mythology. It reads like a colonial administrative structure, complete with territorial governors, specialized departments, and bureaucratic procedures. When British archaeologists first encountered these texts in the 19th century, they unconsciously mapped them onto mythological frameworks because the alternative was too strange. But read without that filter. The texts describe something closer to an extraterrestrial or advanced civilization's management of a less developed population. The implications are unsettling. If this structure was real, it's unlikely to have simply dissolved. Organizations with this level of sophistication and apparent longevity don't casually abandon established systems. The hierarchy wasn't vague spiritual authority. The texts describe specific titles, ranks, responsibilities. At the top sat Anu, described as holding ultimate authority, but remaining largely removed from direct earth management. Below him came the Anunnaki, who actually governed terrestrial operations. Enlil held what the texts call the Tablet of Destinies, a device or authority that allowed him to issue binding commands. He's described as Lord of the Command, the one whose word could not be altered. This sounds less like religious metaphor and more like administrative authority backed by some form of enforcement mechanism. His decisions could be questioned, debated in council, but once made officially, they carried weight that other Anunnaki respected or at least couldn't easily override. Enki held different authority, described as Lord of Wisdom and of the Abzu, the deep waters beneath the earth. In many contexts, it refers to his headquarters, his research facility, his repository of knowledge. The texts describe him conducting experiments there, teaching select humans, developing solutions to problems. He's portrayed as scientist or engineer rather than mystic, someone who understood how things worked and could manipulate them. When humanity needed to be created, Enki provided the technical expertise. When the flood threatened to destroy everyone, Enki engineered a survival solution. His jurisdiction included freshwater sources, an absolutely critical resource in Mesopotamia, giving him practical power independent of his technical knowledge. Ninhursag, sometimes called Ninmah or other names, controlled what the texts describe as biological functions. She assisted Enki in creating humans. She's credited with healing abilities, with understanding of the body, with power over birth and fertility. The texts describe her making decisions about which genetic experiments would proceed, suggesting she held authority over biological research and modification. Her titles include Lady of the Mountain and Mother of the Gods, but also more technical descriptions related to formation and construction of living beings. She wasn't goddess of motherhood in abstract spiritual sense. She was specialist in genetics and biological engineering. Inanna, later known as Ishtar, presents the most complex profile. She's associated with love, fertility, warfare, political power, but the texts describe her as ambitious, aggressive, constantly expanding her influence. She acquires the me, the divine powers or technologies, from Enki through what reads like corporate espionage, getting him drunk and taking them while he's incapacitated. She demands authority over cities. She leads military campaigns. She's portrayed as brilliant but unpredictable, effective but dangerous. The administrative structure had to account for her disruptive presence, suggesting the Anunnaki hierarchy wasn't simple chain of command, but complex network of competing authorities requiring constant negotiation. The texts describe council meetings where decisions were debated and voted upon. Before the flood, the Anunnaki assembly convened to discuss what to do about human population growth. Enlil argued for reduction. Enki opposed him. Others took sides. The decision went to vote. This is bureaucratic procedure, not mythological narrative about capricious gods. Even after decisions were made, the texts show individuals working to undermine outcomes they disagreed with. Enki, despite the council's decision to proceed with the flood, secretly warned Ziusudra and provided survival specifications. This triggered consequences after the flood when the other Anunnaki discovered his intervention. They confronted him, demanded explanation, eventually had to negotiate new agreements about human management going forward. The territorial divisions were explicit. Different Anunnaki controlled different cities and regions. Enlil held Nippur, described as the religious and administrative center. Enki controlled Eridu, the oldest city. Inanna fought for and won control of Uruk. These weren't symbolic patronage. The texts describe actual governance, resource allocation, infrastructure decisions made by the controlling Anunnaki for their territories. When conflicts arose between cities, the texts sometimes frame them as disputes between the Anunnaki who governed those cities, with human armies serving as proxies in larger political struggles among the ruling class. This organizational structure doesn't dissolve just because it becomes less visible. Complex hierarchies with established territories, specialized functions, and bureaucratic procedures tend to persist. They adapt to changing conditions, modify their operational strategies, but maintain underlying structure because that structure encodes centuries of organizational learning about how to manage complex systems. If the Anunnaki established this administrative framework 5,000 years ago, why would they abandon it? They would more likely maintain it while adjusting visibility, operating through established channels that no longer require their direct presence, because the systems self-perpetuate through institutional inertia and the hybrid bloodlines they empowered to govern in their name. Multiple independent Mesopotamian texts describe a catastrophic flood with remarkable consistency and details, but they don't present it as divine punishment for human wickedness. They present it as a political decision made by the Anunnaki Council. Enlil wanted to reduce human population, which had become too numerous and too noisy. Enki opposed this decision and secretly warned Ziusudra, later known as Utnapishtim, giving him specifications to build a vessel that could survive. The texts describe this as a real event, with real political fallout among the Anunnaki themselves. After the flood receded and surviving humans emerged, the council had to develop new agreements about how humanity would be managed going forward. Modern geology confirms that massive flooding events did occur in Mesopotamian history, including a catastrophic inundation of the Black Sea Basin around 5,500 BCE that would have devastated early agricultural communities. The texts might be preserving actual memory of a real event, but one that was deliberately engineered rather than naturally occurring. If the Anunnaki possessed advanced technology and decided to manage human population through controlled catastrophe, a regional flood would be effective while leaving their infrastructure and knowledge centers intact on higher ground. The Atrahasis epic provides the most detailed flood account. The story begins not with human wickedness, but with human noise. The land became wide, the people became numerous. The land was bellowing like a bull. The god was disturbed by their uproar. Enlil heard their noise and said to the great gods, "The noise of mankind has become too much. I am losing sleep because of their racket. This isn't moral judgment. This is population management concern." Humans had become too numerous, too disruptive. Enlil proposed solutions. First disease, then drought, then famine. Each time, Enki countered by teaching humans how to survive, how to propitiate the gods, how to secure resources. Finally, Enlil proposed comprehensive solution: flood that would reset human population to manageable levels. The council debated this proposal. Not all Anunnaki agreed, but eventually Enlil's position prevailed, with the stipulation that all Anunnaki would maintain secrecy so humans couldn't prepare. Enki, bound by oath not to directly warn humans, found a loophole. He spoke to a reed wall, addressing it rather than the humans sleeping on the other side, technically keeping his oath while ensuring Ziusudra overheard the warning. The texts specify the instructions Enki provided: exact dimensions for the boat, materials to use, how to make it watertight, what to bring aboard, when to seal it. These read like engineering specifications, not vague divine guidance. The flood account describes the event with detail, suggesting eyewitness testimony preserved across generations. The storm's violence terrified even the Anunnaki. The gods were frightened by the deluge, and they withdrew. They went up to the heaven of Anu. The gods cowered like dogs crouched by an outside wall. The scale exceeded what they expected. Inanna cried out like a woman in labor, lamenting the destruction. Even Enlil, who had proposed this solution, seemed shaken by the result. When the waters receded and Ziusudra emerged with his family and the animals he'd preserved, offering sacrifice to the gods, the Anunnaki gathered around the offering like flies. desperate and hungry. They had not anticipated how devastating the flood would be or how it would affect their own situation. The post-flood confrontation reveals the political dynamics. When Enlil discovered Ziusudra had survived, he was furious, demanding to know who had revealed the plan. Enki's defense is revealing. How could I disregard my people? How could I let them perish? I did not disclose the secret of the great gods. I let the very wise man learn of it in a dream. The council had to negotiate new agreements. Humanity would be allowed to rebuild, but with certain modifications: reduced lifespans, increased mortality, natural population controls. The texts frame this as political compromise among competing factions, not divine decree from unified authority. Geological evidence supports that catastrophic flooding did occur in the Mesopotamian region, though timing remains debated. The Black Sea Deluge hypothesis, proposed by marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman in 1995, suggests that around 5,500 BCE, the Mediterranean breached a natural dam and catastrophically flooded the Black Sea basin, which had been a freshwater lake. The water level rose rapidly, potentially hundreds of feet, inundating thousands of square miles of inhabited land. This would have devastated early agricultural communities and created precisely the kind of traumatic collective memory that could be preserved through oral tradition for millennia before being recorded in cuneiform texts. But the Mesopotamian texts describe the flood differently than natural disaster. They describe it as deliberate, controlled, engineered. If the Anunnaki possessed advanced technology, triggering regional flooding wouldn't require supernatural power. Strategic destruction of natural barriers, deliberate release of glacial lakes, even weather manipulation if they understood atmospheric dynamics sufficiently. A controlled flood allows precise outcomes, devastating human population in lowlands while preserving temple facilities on elevated platforms, destroying agricultural infrastructure while leaving knowledge repositories intact, creating crisis that requires survivors to depend completely on the Anunnaki for survival guidance during rebuilding. The aftermath texts describe exactly this dependency. The Anunnaki taught survivors how to rebuild, provided seeds for new crops, re-established administrative systems, but they also implemented new controls, new protocols for managing human populations so the same problem wouldn't recur. They created what sounds like surveillance systems, monitoring mechanisms, population limits. They established the patterns of kingship and temple authority that would govern Mesopotamian civilization for millennia. The flood wasn't divine punishment for sin. It was population control measure by managers dealing with growth that threatened their operational parameters. The tablets repeatedly emphasize gold in ways that seem disproportionate for a society that barely used it in practical applications. The Anunnaki demanded it. They accumulated it. They supposedly came to Earth initially to mine it. But why would advanced beings capable of interstellar or interdimensional travel need a metal that, while useful, isn't particularly rare in cosmic terms? Some researchers suggest gold's unique properties, its conductivity and resistance to corrosion, make it valuable for advanced technology we're only beginning to understand. Others note gold's effectiveness in reflecting certain radiation types, potentially useful for beings not adapted to Earth's environment. The texts describe gold being shipped somewhere else, sent away from Earth in quantities that would be staggering even by modern mining standards. Ancient mines in southern Africa show evidence of extensive gold extraction dating back over 100,000 years, far earlier than conventional archaeology suggests humans should have been capable of such operations. If the Anunnaki's initial presence on Earth was indeed resource extraction, it would explain several peculiarities: why they would bother with a relatively primitive species, why they would invest in genetically modifying humans to create better workers, why they established complex supply chains and administrative systems, Resource extraction operations require exactly these elements. The creation texts frame the Anunnaki's initial arrival as resource mission. Before humans existed, the texts describe the Anunnaki themselves performing the labor of excavation and mining. The burden was too great. The work was too hard. They complained. The solution was creating a worker species through genetic modification of existing hominids. This narrative makes sense only if the primary purpose was resource extraction rather than spiritual development or cultural enlightenment. You don't create worker species if you don't have work that needs doing. But why gold specifically? The Sumerian term for gold is kusig, which can be translated as metal of the great hand or noble metal. The tablets describe it being collected, refined, transported to temple facilities, then shipped elsewhere. The volumes mentioned are enormous. One text describes shipments of gold measured in talents, a unit of approximately 30 kilograms, multiple shipments, regular schedules, quantities that would require extensive mining operations to produce. Where was it going? The texts sometimes describe it being sent to the heaven, to Anu, to the place of origin. Modern analysis of gold's properties reveals characteristics that might be valuable for advanced technology. Gold is the most malleable and ductile metal, capable of being hammered into sheets just a few atoms thick. It's an excellent conductor of electricity, surpassed only by silver and copper. But unlike those metals, it doesn't corrode or tarnish. It reflects infrared radiation effectively, making it valuable for radiation shielding or thermal management. It's used in modern spacecraft, satellites, and advanced electronics. NASA uses gold coating on astronaut visors and spacecraft components for radiation protection. If the Anunnaki required materials for technology, infrastructure, or radiation shielding, especially if they came from an environment different from Earth, gold would be a logical choice. Ancient mining operations support the resource extraction hypothesis. In southern Africa, particularly in Swaziland and South Africa, there are extensive ancient gold mining operations that archaeologists struggle to date precisely, but that show evidence of being far older than conventional chronology allows. The Ingwenya mine in Swaziland shows evidence of mining operations dating to at least 43,000 years ago, possibly much older. The scale of these operations is staggering. Shafts descending hundreds of feet, extensive tunnel networks, evidence of sustained organized labor over long periods. Who was mining gold in southern Africa 40,000 years ago or more? Conventional archaeology has no good answer, because modern humans supposedly didn't have the organizational capacity or technological capability for such operations that early. The texts describe gold processing and refining techniques that seem anachronistic for the periods involved. Cupellation, the process of separating gold from silver and other base metals using high temperatures and lead, appears in Mesopotamia already developed. Fire assaying, testing gold purity through controlled melting and oxidation, was practiced with sophistication that typically requires generations of metallurgical experience to develop. Yet these techniques appear essentially complete in the earliest examples, suggesting they were taught rather than discovered. The economic systems of ancient Mesopotamia centered disproportionately on gold acquisition and processing. Trade networks stretched across Asia and Africa primarily to secure gold and other precious metals. Wars were fought over gold sources. Tribute payments were demanded in gold. Temple records catalogue gold holdings with obsessive precision. This emphasis makes sense if the society's fundamental purpose, established by the Anunnaki, was resource extraction. The entire civilization would be organized around gathering and processing the resource, with cultural values, economic systems, and power structures all serving this underlying function. If the Anunnaki never left and continued to benefit from these systems, the gold would still be flowing somewhere, processed through modern financial networks that replaced ancient temple logistics, but serve the same essential function of concentrating the resource in specific hands. Sumerian isn't related to any known language family. It appears in written form, already fully developed with no apparent precursor languages or evolutionary development. Linguists call it an isolate, a language with no relatives, which shouldn't exist in regions with long human habitation, where you'd expect languages to influence each other and share roots. The Sumerian grammatical structure is remarkably sophisticated, capable of expressing complex abstract concepts from its earliest written examples. Even more peculiarly, many Sumerian words seem to be compound terms that describe what something does rather than naming it directly, as if the language was artificially constructed by speakers trying to describe concepts they were encountering for the first time. This is precisely what you'd expect if a group of beings introduced a new language to a population that previously communicated differently. The tablets themselves claim writing was a gift from the Anunnaki, taught to humans through specific individuals who underwent training in temple schools. If you were establishing long-term presence in a region, introducing a sophisticated written language would be crucial for maintaining records, transmitting technical knowledge, and ensuring consistent communication across generations. The fact that Sumerian appears with no development phase suggests it arrived as a complete system rather than evolving locally. Language isolates are rare and always suspicious to linguists. Languages evolve through contact, borrowing, modification. Related languages show family resemblances, shared vocabulary, similar grammatical structures. You can trace Latin through Italian, Spanish, French, Romanian. You can connect Sanskrit, Persian, Greek, Latin, and most European languages through Proto-Indo-European roots. It stands alone, unconnected to any language family. Its grammatical structure uses agglutination, building complex words by stringing together morphemes that each add specific meaning. Its word order, its case system, its verb conjugation patterns don't match any nearby languages from the same period. The writing system emerges already sophisticated. The earliest tablets from Uruk, around 3200 BCE, aren't simple pictograms representing objects. They're already using phonetic elements, grammatical markers, abstract concepts. Within a few generations, cuneiform can express anything spoken language can. Poetry, philosophy, complex technical specifications, legal nuances. There's no archaeological record of the experimental phase, where people worked out how to represent language visually. Sumerian writing appears essentially complete, suggesting it was introduced as finished system rather than developed locally through trial and error. The vocabulary structure reveals something peculiar. Many Sumerian words are compounds that seem to describe function rather than providing simple names. The word for scribe is dubsar, literally tablet writer. The word for copper is urudu, possibly related to a compound meaning mountain metal or bright metal. These feel like descriptive terms created by speakers encountering new concepts and constructing vocabulary to handle them, similar to how English speakers created compound words like automobile, meaning self-moving, when that technology appeared. If the Anunnaki introduced both new technologies and the language to describe them simultaneously, you'd expect exactly this pattern: descriptive compound words explaining what new things do. The tablets explicitly credit the Anunnaki with teaching writing. Nabu, sometimes called son of Marduk, is described as god of writing, literacy, and scribal arts. But he's not portrayed as inspiring humans with abstract concepts. He's described as literally teaching the technical skills of writing to specific individuals who then became first scribes and trained others. The texts describe formal training programs in temple schools where select students learn to read and write under instruction from priests who had learned from earlier teachers in unbroken chains. supposedly stretching back to direct instruction from the Anunnaki themselves. If you were establishing permanent presence among less developed population, introducing written language would be crucial. You need consistent record keeping across generations. You need to transmit technical knowledge without depending on oral traditions' distortions. You need administrative systems tracking resources, labor, obligations. You need legal codes that can be referenced precisely. Introducing a complete writing system serves all these functions immediately, avoiding the centuries of gradual development that natural language evolution requires. The fact that Sumerian appears suddenly, already sophisticated, with no apparent development phase, strongly suggests it was introduced as complete system by someone who already possessed written language and understood its applications. Modern attempts to trace Sumerian's origins have failed. Some researchers proposed connections to Dravidian languages of India, to Turkish and other Altaic languages, even to Basque or Hungarian. None withstand serious linguistic analysis. Sumerian remains truly isolated, a language that appeared in Mesopotamia, with no relatives and left no descendants, used for thousands of years, then extinct as spoken language, though preserved in religious and scholarly contexts. Its isolation isn't easily explained unless you accept it arrived from elsewhere, introduced by speakers who weren't native to the region and who taught it to local population for specific purposes related to administration, record-keeping, and knowledge transmission. The Sumerian King List presents a problem that archaeologists handle by dismissing it as mythological exaggeration. It records rulers before the flood who reigned for thousands of years each, then rulers after the flood with steadily decreasing but still superhuman lifespans of several centuries. Multiple independent sources confirm these same rulers and these same impossible ages. The easy explanation is that ancient scribes were bad at math or recording metaphorical reigns. The uncomfortable explanation is that they were recording what they actually observed. Hybrid rulers with Anunnaki genetics, who indeed lived far longer than normal humans. The texts explicitly connect longevity to bloodline, describing it as inherited from divine parentage. As generations passed and Anunnaki genetic material diluted through interbreeding with regular humans, lifespans shortened toward normal human ranges. This would create exactly the pattern the King List shows. Impossibly long lives tapering gradually to merely exceptional ones, and eventually to normal ones. Modern genetics confirms that lifespan has significant hereditary components, and that certain genetic modifications could theoretically extend human life substantially. If the Anunnaki possessed such modifications and passed them to hybrid offspring, those bloodlines would have possessed tremendous advantages, accumulating knowledge and experience across centuries, maintaining continuity of purpose through periods that would span many normal human generations, cementing their position as eternal ruling class. The numbers are staggering and consistent. Alulim, first king, ruled 28,800 years, according to the King List. Al-Aljar ruled 36,000 years, 8 kings total spanning 241,200 years before the flood. Then the flood came. The texts state matter-of-factly, and afterwards, kingship descended from heaven to Kish. The post-flood rulers show decreasing but still impossible lifespans. Gao ruled 1,200 years. Zukakip ruled 840 years, gradually declining across generations until reaching merely exceptional ages of 100 to 200 years. Then, eventually, normal human ranges. Multiple independent sources confirm the same rulers. The King List exists in multiple copies from different periods and locations, showing consistent information. Other texts reference the same kings, describe their reigns, record their activities. The Epic of Gilgamesh portrays its hero king as possessing superhuman strength and partial immortality, being 2/3 god and 1/3 human. Gilgamesh's quest revolves around seeking full immortality, like Utnapishtim received, suggesting extended life was a real phenomenon associated with specific bloodlines. These aren't isolated legendary claims. They're consistent threads across diverse source materials. The pattern of gradual decline is crucial. If ancient scribes were just exaggerating or recording symbolic ages, you'd expect random, impressive numbers. Instead, you get systematic decrease across generations, exactly what genetic dilution would produce. First-generation hybrids between Anunnaki and humans would carry maximum divine genetic material and show strongest effects, including extreme longevity. Second-generation, breeding with regular humans, would dilute to three-quarters human, showing reduced but still significant effects. Each successive generation breeding with common population would further dilute divine genetics, producing corresponding reduction in superhuman traits, including lifespan. This is standard genetics. Hybrid vigor in first generation, gradual return to baseline as the introduced genes disperse through larger population. Modern genetics confirms lifespan has strong hereditary component. Studies of centenarians show genetic factors contribute significantly to exceptional longevity. Specific genes affect cellular aging, DNA repair, telomere length, metabolic efficiency. Theoretical modifications to human genetics could extend lifespan substantially, enhancing DNA repair mechanisms, slowing cellular senescence, improving mitochondrial function, reducing oxidative damage. If the Anunnaki possessed such genetic modifications, either naturally or through their own bioengineering, and passed these to hybrid offspring, those individuals would indeed live far longer than normal humans. The advantage would be tremendous. A ruler living 3 centuries would accumulate knowledge, experience, and political skills across timescales normal humans can't match. They would personally witness the results of long-term planning. They would develop networks and strategies spanning multiple normal human lifetimes. They would seem almost godlike in wisdom and capability simply through having lived so long. This would cement hybrid bloodlines in power almost automatically. Even as genetic dilution reduced longevity toward normal ranges, the accumulated social advantages, the institutional control, the concentrated knowledge would persist. The families would maintain power not just through genetics, but through everything centuries of genetic advantage had allowed them to build. The texts explicitly connect longevity to divine bloodline. Kings boast of descent from gods as justification for rule. The longer-lived rulers are those claiming closer divine ancestry. As dynasties progress and bloodlines dilute through intermarriage with common population, lifespans decrease while legitimacy claims weaken. Eventually, you get rulers whose divine descent is so distant it no longer provides exceptional longevity, though the claim still provides political authority. The pattern in the texts matches genetic dilution models precisely. This doesn't prove the Anunnaki were real and bred with humans, but it suggests the ancient scribes were recording something they actually observed, a pattern of exceptional longevity associated with specific bloodlines that gradually normalized across generations. The Hieros Gamos, sacred marriage ritual, appears across Mesopotamian city-states with disturbing consistency. Each year, the king would undergo ritual union with a priestess representing Inanna or another goddess, supposedly to ensure the land's fertility and prosperity. But the administrative tablets suggest this wasn't symbolic. They describe careful selection of priestesses based on specific genealogical criteria. They record the children produced from these unions being raised in temple precincts and tracked through special registers. They detail protocols that read less like religious observance and more like controlled breeding programs. If you wanted to maintain hybrid bloodlines across generations, periodically reintroducing genetic material from preserved Anunnaki sources, you would create exactly this kind of ritualized system. The religious framework would ensure compliance while obscuring the biological purpose. Temple priestesses, potentially carrying higher concentrations of Anunnaki genetics, preserved through generations of careful selection, would regularly breed with ruling kings to reinforce desired traits in the royal lineage. The tablets describe women who served in these roles as being themselves of special descent, daughters of previous such unions, creating closed genetic loops that maintained hybrid characteristics. This wasn't ancient superstition. It was genetic management disguised as religious observance. The ritual occurred annually during the New Year festival, the most important event in the Mesopotamian religious calendar. The king, representing Dumuzi, the shepherd god, would enter the temple's innermost chamber. There he would encounter the high priestess, representing Inanna, goddess of love and power. What transpired in that sealed chamber was never described publicly, but the texts indicate actual physical union occurred, not merely symbolic ceremony. The morning after, the king would emerge with renewed authority, his connection to divine power supposedly reaffirmed. The land would be fertile, the crops would grow, the kingdom would prosper. But administrative tablets tracking these events reveal something more calculated. The priestesses weren't chosen randomly from the general population. Temple records describe genealogical requirements. The woman selected for Hierosgamos had to trace descent through specific lines, often daughters of previous priestesses who had served in the same role, or women from families known to carry divine blood. The tablets list their names, their parentage, sometimes going back multiple generations to establish their qualification. This wasn't religious devotion. This was pedigree verification, ensuring the woman possessed appropriate genetic background before allowing her to breed with the king. The children produced from these unions received special treatment that confirms the biological purpose. They weren't simply absorbed into the royal family or raised as ordinary temple staff. They were tracked separately in temple registers, educated in restricted areas of the complex, given training in specialized knowledge. Sons might become priests with access to highest levels of sacred learning, or they might be groomed for kingship in vassal cities. Daughters often became priestesses themselves, continuing the cycle, passing their genetics forward to the next generation, while maintaining the closed loop that concentrated desired traits. Some texts describe the priestesses as themselves divine or semi-divine, possessing qualities that set them apart from common women. They demonstrated knowledge they shouldn't have accessed through normal means. They lived in temple precincts under conditions suggesting they were valued resources being carefully preserved rather than religious devotees serving temporarily. The most prestigious priestesses served for life, maintaining their status across decades, accumulating influence that rivaled kings. Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad around 2300 BCE, served as high priestess of the moon god Nanna at Ur. She's credited as the first known author in history, composing sophisticated hymns and liturgical poetry. But she was also political power, controlling temple resources, commanding religious authority that stabilized her father's empire. Her appointment wasn't spiritual calling, it was strategic placement of someone with appropriate bloodline into position of systemic control. The religious framework provided perfect cover. The population accepted these unions as necessary for cosmic order, ensuring the gods blessed the land. They wouldn't question why only certain bloodlines could serve in these roles, why the children were tracked specially, why the system maintained itself generation after generation with such consistency. If you were managing hybrid genetics across millennia, this is exactly how you'd structure it. Make it religious obligation that no one questions. Create institutional frameworks that self-perpetuate. Ensure the people performing the system understand it as sacred duty, while only the highest initiates recognize the biological reality. The ritual continues not because anyone consciously maintains a breeding program, but because deviation from traditional protocols feels like risking cosmic disaster. The pattern persists beyond Mesopotamia. Egyptian pharaohs practiced sibling marriage, justified religiously but serving to concentrate bloodline traits. The pharaoh would marry his sister. Their children would inherit concentrated divine genetics. Greek mystery cults included sacred marriage rituals where initiates underwent symbolic or actual unions with priestesses representing goddesses. Roman Vestal virgins, supposedly celibate, came from specific patrician families and served religious functions that gave them unusual legal and social power. Medieval courtly love traditions and the cult of the Virgin Mary preserved echoes of the sacred feminine. All these might be cultural evolution of the same system, established originally in Mesopotamia, dispersing through cultural contact and migration, maintaining its essential function even as its original purpose became obscured. Cylinder seals are among the most common artifacts from ancient Mesopotamia. Small stone cylinders carved with intricate designs that left distinctive impressions when rolled across wet clay. They served as signatures, proving identity and authority on contracts and official documents. They often depict the Anunnaki in their non-human form, presenting them to the tablet's holder as if the seal granted authority from these beings. The seals were hereditary, passed through bloodlines, and their possession determined who could issue certain commands or access specific knowledge. The most important seals were stored in temple sanctuaries and brought out only for the highest level transactions. Some seals show technical diagrams, astronomical charts, or symbolic systems that experts still haven't fully decoded. They functioned as keys, both literal and metaphorical. Possession of certain seals granted physical access to locked areas of temple complexes. It also granted social access to knowledge and authority that others could not claim. If the Anunnaki established a system of control through trusted bloodlines, they would need verification methods, ways to ensure that only authorized individuals could access crucial systems or command resources. The cylinder seals served exactly this function, physical tokens that proved descent and authorization while simultaneously depicting the source of that authority so no one would forget who ultimately held power. These weren't simple decorative objects. They were carved from semi-precious stones. Lapis lazuli, carnelian, hematite, sometimes more exotic materials. The carving required tremendous skill, working in miniature to create complex scenes that would read clearly when rolled across clay. The investment of labor and material indicates they held value beyond mere identification. They were status symbols, authority tokens, keys to systems that controlled resources and knowledge. Possession of the right seal could mean the difference between access and exclusion. The imagery reveals the system's nature. Many seals depict presentation scenes, a human figure standing before seated Anunnaki, often with an intermediary figure introducing them. The human is small, subordinate. The Anunnaki are larger, seated on thrones, wearing horned crowns that signify their status. Sometimes the Anunnaki are shown with wings or with unusual features that emphasize their non-human nature. The scene captures hierarchy visually. The human approaches the gods through proper channels, recognized and authorized to be there. When this seal was pressed into clay to authenticate a document, it claimed the document carried authority, ultimately derived from the Anunnaki themselves. Some seals show more technical imagery, star patterns, astronomical diagrams, geometric designs that might represent architectural plans or symbolic systems. The famous seal, VA243, held at the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, shows what appears to be a solar system with multiple planetary bodies orbiting a central sun, a conception of cosmology that supposedly didn't exist in ancient Mesopotamia. Other seals display what look like technical specifications, measurements, formulas encoded in visual form that experts haven't fully decoded. These seals weren't just authentication devices, they were knowledge containers, carrying information in compact form that could be transmitted by impressing the seal onto tablets sent to distant locations. The seals were strictly hereditary. They passed from father to son, or occasionally to designated heirs if direct descent failed. Losing a seal was catastrophic. It meant losing identity, authority, legal standing. The tablets record disputes over seal ownership, accusations of theft, elaborate procedures for transferring seals when bloodlines ended. This makes sense only if the seals represented more than personal property. They represented bloodline authority, the accumulated legitimacy of entire family lines descended from original authorization by the Anunnaki. Without the seal, you couldn't prove who you were in ways that mattered for access to power. The most important seals never left temple control. They were stored in secure chambers, brought out only for the highest level transactions, coronations, major treaties, transfers of territorial authority. Their designs were never copied or replicated, ensuring uniqueness. Temple records tracked their use meticulously. Who had accessed which seal, when, for what purpose? This level of control suggests the seals functioned as physical keys to systems that required authorization to activate, perhaps literally. Certain doors or containers in temple complexes that opened only when the proper seal was presented, perhaps metaphorically. Certain commands or transactions that were honored only when authenticated by specific seals known to carry authority. Modern equivalent would be cryptographic keys, digital certificates that prove identity and grant access to secure systems. You can't fake them, they're unique. Possession proves authorization, but the Mesopotamian seals carried additional layer. They visually depicted the source of authority, reminding everyone that power flowed from the Anunnaki, that human authority was delegated rather than inherent. The system maintained ideological control alongside practical function. Even as the Anunnaki withdrew from direct visibility, their images remained on every official document, every contract, every legal proceeding. You couldn't participate in the systems of power without literally pressing their image into clay, acknowledging their ultimate authority with every transaction. The texts describe a class of beings called the Igigi, often translated as watchers, who performed tasks for the higher-ranking Anunnaki. They observed humanity, reported back on developments, and sometimes intervened in human affairs when authorized. But here's what's strange. The texts never describe the Igigi leaving either. They describe them tiring of their servitude, even rebelling at one point, but ultimately continuing to function in their roles. Later traditions carry this forward. Hebrew texts describe watchers who descended to earth and took human wives, producing hybrid offspring. Greek accounts mention daimones, intermediate beings between gods and humans who guided and observed mortal affairs. Medieval grimoires catalogue hierarchies of entities who can be contacted for knowledge or assistance, described as serving higher powers while maintaining positions in the human world. What if these weren't separate mythologies but descriptions of the same phenomenon? A class of beings, perhaps themselves hybrids, or perhaps lesser Anunnaki, who remained on Earth as observers and managers after the primary group withdrew from direct visibility. Intelligence agencies use similar structures, field operatives maintaining cover while reporting to command structures the general population never sees. If the Anunnaki established such a system, it would require minimal direct intervention while ensuring their interests continued to be served. The Atrahasis epic describes the Igigi as performing difficult labor before humans were created. They dug the rivers. They excavated the canals. The work was crushing, the burden too great. Eventually they rebelled, surrounding Enlil's house, refusing to continue. This crisis prompted the creation of humans to take over the labor. But the texts don't describe the Igigi departing after humans assumed the work. Instead, they transitioned to different roles: supervision, observation, coordination. They become the middle management layer between the high-ranking Anunnaki and the human population. The term Igigi itself is sometimes interpreted as watchers or those who observe. Their function evolved from laborers to monitors, maintaining surveillance on human populations, reporting developments to higher authorities, intervening when necessary to maintain control or prevent problems. This is exactly the role structure you'd establish if you wanted to step back from direct management while ensuring you maintained awareness and influence. The Igigi would be your eyes and hands in the world, present among the population but operating with authority that set them apart. The Book of Enoch, a Hebrew text from approximately 3rd century BCE but drawing from much older traditions, describes watchers in detail. 200 watchers descended to Mount Hermon. They took human wives. They taught humanity forbidden knowledge: metallurgy, cosmetics, enchantments, astrology. They produced offspring called Nephilim, giants who consumed everything and spread violence across the earth. This story parallels the Mesopotamian accounts precisely. Beings from the Anunnaki hierarchy interbreeding with humans, producing hybrids, transferring knowledge that was supposed to remain restricted. The Book of Enoch presents this as transgression, angels falling from their proper roles. But read it alongside Mesopotamian sources and it looks like the same phenomenon described from different cultural perspective. The Watchers maintained presence on Earth, interacted with humanity, sometimes exceeded their authority by sharing knowledge or producing offspring without proper authorization. Greek daimones served similar function. They weren't gods but weren't human either. They occupied intermediate space, acting as messengers, guardians, guides. Socrates claimed a daimon advised him throughout his life, warning him away from poor decisions, guiding his philosophical inquiries. He described it as actual entity that communicated with him. Plato systematized the concept. Daimones mediated between gods and humans, carrying prayers upward and blessings downward, maintaining connection between mortal and divine realms. This mediating function matches the Igigi role precisely. Medieval grimoires like the Lesser Key of Solomon catalogue elaborate hierarchies of entities that could be summoned and commanded through proper procedures. These texts describe demons, but the term originally meant something different. Daemon, from Greek daimon, meant intermediate spirits. The grimoires present them as serving higher powers while being accessible to humans who knew the proper protocols. They could provide knowledge, assistance, influence events. They operated within constraints, under authority they couldn't override. This sounds less like evil supernatural beings and more like field operatives working within an established chain of command, able to help or hinder humans, but ultimately answerable to higher authorities. What if these weren't separate mythologies but cultural variations describing the same phenomenon? A class of beings, perhaps hybrid themselves, perhaps lesser members of the Anunnaki hierarchy, who remained on Earth as permanent observers and occasional interventionists. They would maintain surveillance, report to higher authorities who had withdrawn from visibility, intervene when necessary to guide human development or correct deviations from desired patterns. Most humans would never encounter them. Those who did would interpret the experience through available cultural frameworks: angels, demons, spirits, aliens, depending on the era and belief system. But the underlying phenomenon would remain consistent. Beings with capabilities exceeding normal humans, operating under authority from sources humans rarely see, maintaining presence across millennia while civilizations rise and fall around them. Secret societies obsessed with ancient knowledge didn't begin in medieval Europe. They trace back to temple schools of Mesopotamia and Egypt, where select individuals underwent years of training in systems supposedly descended from the gods. The initiatory process served multiple functions. It filtered candidates, ensuring only those with proper genealogy, or proven trustworthiness gained access to higher levels of knowledge. It created psychological bonds, making initiates feel special and privileged while binding them to secrecy. It structured knowledge hierarchically, revealing information gradually, so even if an initiate broke oaths and revealed lower-level secrets, the truly crucial information remained protected. But most importantly, it created continuity. When civilizations collapsed and kingdoms fell, the mystery schools survived by going underground, preserving knowledge through small groups of trained initiates who would wait for stable conditions to re-emerge. This pattern repeats throughout history. Eleusinian mysteries, Pythagorean brotherhood, Hermetic orders, Rosicrucians, Freemasons, each claims descent from ancient sources. Preservation of old knowledge, hierarchical initiation, and selective recruitment. What if these weren't independent developments but linked manifestations of the same system, established by the Anunnaki to ensure crucial knowledge and genetic lines would survive across millennia regardless of surface civilization's stability? The temple schools of Mesopotamia operated openly for centuries, training priests, scribes, administrators in complex knowledge systems. But they included inner circles, restricted teachings, graduated levels of initiation. Not everyone who learned to read and write gained access to the mathematical tables. Not everyone who learned mathematics accessed the astronomical predictions. Not everyone who learned astronomy accessed the deepest temple archives or participated in the most restricted rituals. Knowledge was stratified, parceled out according to birth, aptitude, and demonstrated reliability. The initiatory process began young, often in childhood for those from appropriate families. Students learned basic skills first: reading, writing, arithmetic. Those who excelled advanced to higher studies. Complex mathematics, astronomical calculation, legal interpretation. A smaller group advanced further to sacred knowledge. Rituals, temple protocols, communication with divine powers. The highest level, restricted to select individuals from the most prestigious bloodlines, supposedly included direct contact with the Anunnaki themselves, reception of knowledge and authority that couldn't be transmitted through normal teaching. The psychological impact of initiation was deliberate and powerful. At each level, the initiate underwent ceremonies that marked their advancement, made them feel they were entering rarefied company, accessing secrets that set them apart from ordinary people. They swore oaths of secrecy, faced symbolic tests of courage or dedication, received new names or titles that emphasized their transformed status. This created intense loyalty to the institution and the knowledge it guarded. Breaking oaths meant expulsion, loss of status, sometimes death. The initiates became psychologically invested in maintaining the system that had granted them special status. The hierarchical structure provided security through compartmentalization. Lower-level initiates knew only what they needed for their functions. If they betrayed the organization or shared what they knew, they couldn't compromise the truly crucial information because they'd never accessed it. Middle-level initiates knew more but still lacked the complete picture. Only those at the highest levels understood the full system, and they were selected precisely for their absolute reliability, often from bloodlines that had served the temple for generations, carrying family traditions of service alongside genetic predisposition toward the role. When civilizations collapsed, as they periodically did across history, the temple schools maintained continuity by going underground. The knowledge couldn't be lost. It was too important, representing accumulated wisdom from the Anunnaki themselves. Small groups of initiated preservers would maintain the teachings in secret, passing them to carefully selected students, waiting for conditions stable enough to re-emerge publicly. This pattern appears throughout history whenever civilizations face catastrophe. Knowledge goes underground, preserved by secret organizations until safer times. The Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece claimed descent from extremely ancient sources, predating Greek civilization itself. Initiates underwent elaborate ceremonies at Eleusis near Athens, experiencing visions and revelations that supposedly transformed their understanding of life and death. The specific teachings were never written down. Initiates maintained perfect secrecy for over 1,000 years, but the structure was familiar: levels of initiation, sworn secrecy, claims of ancient knowledge, select membership. The mysteries survived until Christianity forcibly closed them in the 4th century CE. But did the knowledge actually disappear, or did it simply go deeper underground? Pythagoras, around 530 BCE, founded a school that was part philosophical academy, part religious cult, part political organization. Pythagoreans followed strict rules, maintained secrecy about their teachings, believed in transmigration of souls and special significance of numbers and mathematical relationships. They claimed their knowledge came from ancient sources, possibly Egyptian or Mesopotamian. Their influence persisted long after Pythagoras' death, their ideas influencing Plato and subsequent Western philosophy. Were they preserving fragments of temple knowledge from earlier civilizations? The Hermetic tradition, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, supposedly combined Egyptian and Greek wisdom. The Hermetic texts describe principles of cosmic order, methods of spiritual development, techniques for accessing hidden knowledge. They influenced Islamic scholars during the medieval period, then Christian scholars during the Renaissance. Rosicrucians emerged in 17th century Europe claiming ancient origins, possession of secret wisdom, mastery of natural forces. Freemasons organized in 18th century with elaborate rituals, hierarchical degrees, claims of descent from medieval stonemasons who had preserved ancient architectural secrets. Each organization insisted it possessed genuine ancient knowledge passed through unbroken chains of initiated teachers. What if they're right? What if these organizations, whatever their modern forms might be, do preserve fragments of the original system established by the Anunnaki in Mesopotamian temples thousands of years ago? The pattern is too consistent: hierarchical initiation, sworn secrecy, claims of ancient descent, preservation of specialized knowledge. This structure serves specific purpose: maintaining crucial information across millennia regardless of surface civilization's stability, ensuring that bloodlines and knowledge systems established originally never fully disappear, creating redundant preservation networks that can survive catastrophe and re-emerge when conditions permit. Mesopotamian temples were impressive, but built within comprehensible technical limits for their era. But examine megalithic structures from the same period across different continents, and the engineering becomes inexplicable. Stones weighing hundreds of tons moved distances that would challenge modern equipment, fitted together with precision that seems unnecessary for the stated purpose, aligned to astronomical configurations that shouldn't have been priority for struggling early civilizations. The stones at Baalbek, the precision of Puma Punku, the logistics of Göbekli Tepe. These require knowledge and capability that doesn't match conventional chronology. Here's where it connects. Many of these sites predate Sumerian civilization or appear contemporary with it, and they're often associated with foundation myths involving gods or giants who taught humanity building techniques. What if the Anunnaki presence wasn't limited to Mesopotamia? What if they established facilities or observation points across the planet, each served by local human populations who preserved garbled memories of the builders? This would explain why similar themes appear in disconnected cultures: gods from the sky, hybrid offspring, advanced knowledge given then restricted, obsessive astronomical observation. If you were managing a planetary population, you wouldn't concentrate everything in one region. You'd establish a distributed network of facilities and authorized bloodlines, ensuring redundancy and maintaining capability to observe or intervene anywhere conditions required attention. The trilithon stones at Baalbek in modern Lebanon present engineering impossibility. 3 massive blocks, each weighing approximately 800 tons, positioned precisely in a temple foundation. Moving 800-ton stones would challenge modern heavy equipment. Quarrying them without steel tools seems impossible. The Roman temple complex was built atop these stones, but the Romans didn't claim to have placed them. Roman engineers were excellent, but they typically worked with stones weighing tons, not hundreds of tons. Local tradition attributed the massive foundation to giants or gods who built before human civilization. The stones remain inexplicable using conventional archaeology. Pumapunku in Bolivia demonstrates precision that exceeds utilitarian requirements. Andesite blocks weighing up to 130 tons, cut with accuracy suggesting machine tools, surfaces flat to within fractions of millimeters. Perfectly straight edges, complex interlocking joints that would require sophisticated planning and execution. The site dates to approximately 536 CE according to conventional chronology, but some researchers argue the precision suggests much older origin, with later cultures building atop existing foundations. Local Amara tradition says the site was built by the gods in a single night, which obviously isn't literal but might preserve memory of construction by beings with capabilities far exceeding what local population possessed. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey completely disrupts conventional timelines. Massive stone pillars weighing up to 16 tons, carved with sophisticated imagery, arranged in circular complexes that show evidence of astronomical alignments. The site dates to approximately 9600 BCE, making it older than agriculture, older than pottery, older than metal tools, older than everything civilization supposedly requires before investing in monumental architecture. Hunter-gatherers living in temporary camps supposedly organized the labor to quarry, transport, erect, and carve these massive structures. Why? The conventional explanation suggests religious motivation, but that doesn't address capability. How did they move 16-ton stones without domesticated animals, wheels, or metal tools? Who taught them stone carving techniques that produced sophisticated results? The site's excavator, Klaus Schmidt, suggested it demonstrates that organized religion preceded agriculture rather than following from it. But the precision and scale still exceed what the conventional timeline allows. These sites share patterns. Massive stones moved improbable distances, precision that seems unnecessary for the era. Astronomical alignments suggesting sophisticated observational capability. And crucially, local traditions attributing construction to gods, giants, or ancient race of builders distinct from current population. The traditions are consistent despite geographic separation and lack of contact between cultures. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, Baalbek in Lebanon, the pyramids of Egypt, Tiwanaku and Pumapunku in Bolivia, Nan Madol in Micronesia, Easter Island, massive stones, precise alignment, gods taught us. Over and over, the same themes. What if these weren't independent developments but coordinated facilities established by the same group across the planet? If the Anunnaki operated globally rather than limiting themselves to Mesopotamia, they would establish multiple sites serving various functions: astronomical observatories, communication nodes, resource processing facilities, governance centers for different regions. Each site would be served by local human populations who maintained the facilities after the Anunnaki withdrew from direct visibility. Those populations would preserve garbled memories of the builders, stories of gods or giants who possessed capabilities far exceeding normal humans. The astronomical alignments suggest coordinated purpose. Many megalithic sites track solstices, equinoxes, specific stellar risings, long-period celestial cycles. This obsessive astronomical observation matches the pattern in Mesopotamia exactly. If you were maintaining surveillance on cosmic cycles for specific purpose, perhaps watching for signs of return or monitoring celestial conditions that affected your operations, you would establish observation posts distributed across the planet. Each post would track the sky from its location, collectively providing comprehensive coverage. The data would be compiled, analyzed, used to maintain awareness of celestial configurations that mattered for reasons the local human populations who maintained the sites no longer understood. The global distribution explains cultural similarities better than independent development. Why do disconnected cultures share myths of gods descending from sky, breeding with humans, teaching civilization, then withdrawing while promising eventual return? Why do they all practice astronomical observation with intensity that seems disproportionate to practical benefit? Why do their ruling classes all claim divine descent and maintain elaborate genealogical records? If the Anunnaki established presence globally, taught similar systems to different populations, installed hybrid bloodlines to govern in their absence, you would expect exactly these cross-cultural patterns. The details would vary based on local conditions and cultural evolution, but the underlying structure would remain consistent because it derived from the same source. Modern genetic analysis has uncovered several peculiarities in the human genome that don't fit clean evolutionary models. Fragments of DNA that appear to have been inserted rather than inherited. Gene sequences that turned on suddenly in human history with no apparent selective pressure. Anomalous distribution of certain markers, suggesting population bottlenecks or admixture events that don't match archaeological evidence. Most controversially, some researchers claim to have identified genetic sequences that show signs of deliberate engineering. The texts describe the Anunnaki mixing their essence with human genetics to create a hybrid workforce. If this actually happened through advanced genetic manipulation, evidence would persist in human DNA as insertions, modifications, or regulatory sequences that control expression of certain traits. We're finding exactly such anomalies, though interpreting them remains contentious. Additionally, human chromosome 2 shows clear evidence of being a fusion of two separate chromosomes at some point in our relatively recent past, a change that would normally be catastrophic but somehow fixed itself in the breeding population. Natural fusion and fixation of this type is extraordinarily unlikely, but deliberately inducing and managing such a change becomes plausible if someone with advanced knowledge wanted to make fundamental modifications to human genetics. The Human Genome Project, completed in 2003, mapped our entire genetic code for the first time. The human genome contains approximately 3 billion base pairs, encoding roughly 20,000 to 25,000 genes. But here's what's strange. Only about 2% of our DNA actually codes for proteins. The other 98% was initially dismissed as junk DNA, evolutionary leftovers with no function. But subsequent research revealed this so-called junk includes regulatory sequences that control when and how genes are expressed. Some of it remains mysterious, segments that don't match expected patterns for evolutionary accumulation of neutral mutations. They look inserted, as if someone added code to an existing program. Human accelerated regions, or HARs, are stretches of DNA that remain nearly unchanged across hundreds of millions of years of evolution in other species, but show rapid, concentrated change in humans within the last 6 million years. HAR1, for instance, is almost identical in chickens and chimpanzees despite 300 million years of separate evolution. But in humans, it shows 18 changes from the chimpanzee version, changes that occurred in just 6 million years. Highly conserved regions stay conserved because mutations there are usually harmful. Yet somehow in humans, multiple mutations in HAR1 became fixed in the population despite the region's importance in regulating brain development. This looks less like natural selection and more like deliberate modification of crucial regulatory sequences. The FOXP2 gene shows similar anomalies. Humans share 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees, but the human version of FOXP2 differs by just 2 amino acids. Those 2 changes affect how the gene functions, influencing language capability, fine motor control, sequential learning. When researchers introduced human FOXP2 into mice, the mice showed altered brain development and vocalization patterns, 2 tiny changes cascading through multiple systems, as if they were designed to integrate several functions simultaneously. The mutations appear suddenly in the fossil record, coinciding with behaviorally modern humans. They don't show gradual improvement from ancestral versions. They arrive complete. Most strikingly, human chromosome 2 is a fusion of 2 chromosomes that remain separate in all other great apes. You can see the fusion point clearly, a remnant centromere, telomeric sequences in the middle of the chromosome where they shouldn't be, genetic signatures of 2 chromosomes that merged. Chromosomal fusions are rare and typically lethal. For a fusion to become fixed in a population, it would need to occur in multiple individuals simultaneously, or a single individual with the fusion would need to successfully breed with normal individuals despite the genetic incompatibility. And somehow, the fusion version would need to become dominant in the population. The probability of this happening naturally is functionally 0. But if someone wanted to make fundamental changes to human genetics, inducing a chromosomal fusion would allow wholesale reorganization of genetic material. You could introduce new sequences, modify regulatory networks, restructure gene organization. The fusion point on human chromosome 2 sits near regions involved in brain development and immune function. This wasn't random mutation. This looks engineered. Population genetics reveals other anomalies. Mitochondrial Eve, the most recent common female ancestor of all living humans, lived approximately 150,000 to 200,000 years ago, according to genetic molecular clock analysis. Chromosomal Adam, the most recent common male ancestor, lived approximately 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. But both show evidence of severe population bottlenecks, moments when human population crashed to perhaps 10,000 individuals or fewer. Additionally, different human populations show unexpected genetic patterns. Some groups carry DNA fragments from archaic hominids like Neanderthals or Denisovans, but the distribution is uneven, and some markers appear in populations separated by vast geographic distances, with no evidence of contact. It's as if genetic material was introduced in specific populations at specific times through mechanisms we don't understand. Some controversial researchers claim to have found what they interpret as artificial signatures in human DNA. Mathematical patterns, information density exceeding what random mutation should produce, regulatory sequences that seem too elegant for evolutionary accident. Mainstream genetics dismisses these claims as pattern-seeking in random noise. But what if some genetic changes in human history weren't random? What if the Anunnaki texts describing genetic modification preserve memory of actual intervention? The evidence doesn't prove it, but it doesn't rule it out either. The anomalies exist. Interpreting what they mean remains contentious, but the fact that human genetics shows multiple features that don't fit clean evolutionary models suggests our origin story might be more complex than conventional science acknowledges. If the Anunnaki never left and still maintain influence, how would that influence operate? But indirect control through established systems would be nearly invisible and remarkably stable. The texts describe them establishing institutions, priesthoods, kingship, temple bureaucracies, knowledge hierarchies. These weren't temporary structures. They became the template for human civilization itself. Monarchy, religious hierarchy, secret societies, academic gatekeeping, financial systems that concentrate control through bloodline inheritance, all follow patterns established in ancient Mesopotamia. You don't need to continuously intervene if you've designed the system well. You establish initial conditions, embed incentives that make people maintain the system without understanding its ultimate purpose, and create mechanisms that naturally promote individuals carrying your genetic markers or adhering to your priorities. Then you simply monitor, making occasional adjustments when the system drifts too far from preferred parameters. This is how complex systems are controlled, not through constant management, but through proper initial design and selective intervention at leverage points. If hybrid bloodlines naturally gravitated toward positions of power due to genetic advantages, if knowledge systems naturally restricted crucial information to authorized initiates, if financial structures naturally concentrated wealth along established lines, you would have control without needing to be visible. The genius of systemic control is that it doesn't require constant attention. You design self-perpetuating structures where the people operating them maintain the system without understanding its ultimate purpose. They follow protocols because deviation feels wrong, risky, or impractical. They promote individuals who fit certain profiles because those individuals seem naturally suited for leadership. They concentrate resources along established channels because those channels have proven reliable. The system runs itself through institutional inertia and embedded incentives. Consider how monarchy functioned. Kings claimed divine right to rule, authority flowing from gods through bloodlines. The population accepted this because challenging it meant risking cosmic order. Kings married strategically, maintaining bloodlines that concentrated desired traits. When dynasties weakened, new dynasties emerged from related bloodlines or through religious legitimation from the same temple systems. The structure persisted across millennia with remarkable consistency. Even when specific kingdoms fell, the template remained: hereditary authority, divine legitimation, bloodline inheritance, temple involvement in confirming succession. This wasn't coincidence. This was system design that ensured continuity regardless of individual rulers' success or failure. Religious hierarchies operated similarly. Priests maintained knowledge, controlled access to divine communication, legitimated political authority, preserved teachings through initiatory systems. They claimed no personal power, just service to gods. But their service gave them tremendous influence over rulers and populations. They determined who was legitimate, what actions pleased the gods, how resources should be allocated for divine purposes. The structure concentrated authority while obscuring whose interests it actually served. If the Anunnaki designed this system, it would allow them to influence human affairs through layers of intermediaries who believed they served divine principles rather than recognizing they maintained control structures benefiting beings who had withdrawn from visibility. Financial systems show the same patterns. Temple institutions in Mesopotamia functioned as banks, holding deposits, making loans, charging interest. The practices spread through subsequent civilizations, evolving into modern banking but maintaining core features. Concentration of capital, compound interest that ensures wealth accumulates to those who already possess it. Family-controlled institutions that persist across generations. Banking families like the Medicis, Rothschilds, and others maintained influence for centuries by controlling capital flows. They simply occupied crucial nodes in financial networks, positions that gave them leverage far exceeding their actual wealth. If certain bloodlines were positioned in such nodes originally by Anunnaki design, the system would naturally maintain their influence across millennia without requiring active intervention. Educational and knowledge systems gatekeep information through credential requirements, peer review, and academic hierarchies that determine whose ideas are taken seriously. This serves legitimate functions, filtering nonsense and maintaining standards. But it also ensures knowledge accumulation follows established channels, with innovative or challenging ideas requiring exceptional effort to gain acceptance. If crucial knowledge was restricted originally to authorized bloodlines and institutions, modern academic structures would naturally continue that restriction through mechanisms that feel like quality control but function as access control. The people operating these systems believe they're maintaining intellectual standards. They probably are, but the structure also ensures certain types of knowledge remain concentrated in specific institutions controlled by established networks. The brilliance of systemic control is that it feels natural. People maintain these structures because they seem like the obvious way to organize society. Kings should rule, they have breeding and training for it. Priests should guide spiritual matters, they have the knowledge. Banks should control capital, they have the expertise. Universities should gatekeep knowledge, they maintain standards. Each piece makes sense individually. Collectively, they create a system where power, knowledge, and resources flow along predetermined channels to individuals from specific backgrounds, maintaining patterns established thousands of years ago. If the Anunnaki designed this system initially, and it was good design, it would still be operating essentially as intended millennia later, requiring minimal intervention to maintain function. Here's what's strange. Cultures worldwide preserve myths about gods or enlightened beings who came, taught humanity, then departed with promises to return. The Mesopotamian texts describe cycles, periods when the Anunnaki would be more or less active in human affairs. Hindu texts describe yugas, vast cycles of rise and fall spanning hundreds of thousands of years. Mesoamerican calendars track enormous time periods and predict returns of Quetzalcoatl or other culture bringers. Norse mythology anticipates Ragnarok, a time of return and reckoning. Christian apocalyptic literature describes second comings and revelations. These aren't vague legends. They're often quite specific about conditions, signs, or timings associated with return. The Sumerian astronomical texts track cycles spanning millennia, calculating future positions of celestial bodies with precision that suggests this timeline mattered for reasons beyond academic interest. What if these aren't independent mythologies but fragmented preservation of actual information? If the Anunnaki operate on timescales measured in millennia and maintain presence through long-term planning, they would absolutely communicate expectations about future periods of increased activity. They would want selected human groups maintaining certain knowledge and preparations across generations. The myths could be degraded versions of actual schedules, preserved through oral tradition and religious framework long after their original context was lost. The Mesopotamian texts describe time cyclically rather than linearly. Events recur, patterns repeat. The Great Year, the precessional cycle of approximately 25,772 years, marks vast cosmic cycles within which smaller cycles nest. The texts track these cycles with obsessive precision, as if certain periods mattered intensely. They describe ages when the gods walked among humans, ages when they withdrew, predictions of ages when they would return to restore proper order. This isn't vague mythology. This is calendrical precision suggesting actual scheduled events operating on timescales beyond individual human comprehension. Hindu cosmology describes yugas, vast ages spanning millions of years. The current age, Kali Yuga, began approximately 5,000 years ago and will last approximately 430,000 years. It's an age of decline, when Dharma weakens and humanity strays from divine order. But it will end eventually, followed by destruction and renewal as the cycle begins again with Satya Yuga, a golden age when gods and humans interact directly. The timescales are enormous, but the pattern matches Mesopotamian concepts. Cycles of divine presence and absence, ages of rise and decline, eventual return and restoration, different cultures preserving the same cosmic structure through different numerical systems. Mesoamerican calendars, particularly the Maya long count, track time with sophistication that amazed modern astronomers when they first decoded it. The calendar tracks multiple cycles simultaneously. The Tzolk'in sacred calendar of 260 days, the Hab civil calendar of 365 days, larger cycles spanning thousands of years. The long count tracked time from a starting point around 3114 BCE, counting forward through backturns of approximately 400 years each. 13 backturns completed the Great Cycle, approximately 5,125 years. The cycle that began in 3114 BCE completed on December 21st, 2012, prompting predictions of transformation or return. The calendar's precision in tracking astronomical phenomena, particularly Venus cycles and eclipse patterns, demonstrates sophisticated understanding maintained across millennia. But why track such vast cycles unless they marked something significant? Norse mythology describes Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, a period of catastrophic destruction followed by renewal. The gods will return to fight final battle against chaotic forces. The world will be destroyed by fire and flood. But afterwards, new world emerges, and some gods return to establish new order. The details are vivid. Specific signs precede the event. Particular sequences of disasters occur. Named individuals play crucial roles. This reads less like vague prophecy and more like description of expected events, procedures to follow when certain conditions manifest. Christian apocalyptic literature, particularly the Book of Revelation, describes return of Christ to establish kingdom on earth, but only after specific sequences of tribulation, warfare, and cosmic signs. 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls of wrath, each marking stages of transformation. The imagery is symbolic, but it describes a process, a timeline of events leading to ultimate revelation and restoration of divine order. Early Christians expected this return imminently. It didn't happen. Later interpretations pushed it further into future, but maintained the expectation. He will return, conditions will align, the pattern will complete. What if these aren't independent mythologies but cultural variations of the same transmitted information? If the Anunnaki operate on timescales measured in millennia and plan to return or increase their activity during specific periods, they would communicate this to select humans who would preserve the information across generations. The original precision would degrade through oral tradition and cultural evolution, but the core pattern would persist. They came before. They taught us. They withdrew. They will return when conditions are right. Watch for the signs. Maintain the knowledge. Be ready. The myths serve as long-term memory storage, preserving crucial information about cyclical patterns that operate beyond individual human lifespans, ensuring that when the right time approaches, someone will recognize the signs and understand what they mean. Conspiracy theories about elite bloodlines controlling global affairs typically get dismissed as anti-Semitic fantasy or paranoid delusion. But stripped of the dramatic narrative, there's a documentable fact. Certain family lines have maintained disproportionate influence across centuries through careful preservation of genealogy and strategic marriage. European nobility obsessively tracked descent, sometimes claiming lineage back to ancient Mesopotamia or Egypt through Byzantine and Roman connections. Banking families emerged from temple money-lending traditions that traced directly to Mesopotamian economic systems. Secret societies recruit from specific families and universities, maintaining networks that span generations. The mechanism isn't supernatural. It's simply advantage compounding. Families with wealth maintain wealth. Families with knowledge preserve knowledge. Families with power understand how power operates. But what if some of these families are maintaining more than social status? What if certain lines do carry genetic material from ancient hybrids? concentrated through centuries of careful breeding. The biological advantages would be subtle but real, perhaps slightly extended health span, perhaps enhanced cognitive processing, perhaps simply statistical likelihood of producing capable individuals. You wouldn't need dramatic differences. Even small genetic advantages compounding across 30 generations would create exactly what we observe. Certain families persistently occupying positions of influence despite changing political systems and geographic regions. The Anunnaki wouldn't need to directly intervene if they'd embedded genetic and institutional advantages that naturally perpetuated themselves. European nobility maintained genealogies with religious devotion. They traced descent through Byzantine emperors back to Roman patricians, through Celtic and Germanic kings to legendary founders. Some claimed descent from Troy through Brutus or Aeneas. Others claimed descent from biblical patriarchs or even from unions between divine beings and mortal women. These weren't just propaganda. They were carefully maintained records passed through generations, used to establish marriage alliances, determine inheritance rights, justify political authority. The nobility enforced strict rules against misalliance, marriage below one's station. A noble who married a commoner faced social death, loss of title, disinheritance. Why such obsession with blood purity if blood was just social construct? Banking families show similar patterns. The Medicis dominated Florence for centuries, controlling wealth and political power through strategic marriages and careful positioning in financial networks. The Rothschilds expanded from Frankfurt in the 18th century to establish banking operations across Europe, maintaining family control through generations. They positioned themselves at crucial nodes of financial systems where they could influence capital flows, determine credit access, affect political decisions. They married within narrow circles, creating networks of interrelated families spanning continents. The mechanism is straightforward. Families with advantages preserve advantages. But what if some advantages were genetic, inherited from ancient bloodlines carrying Anunnaki material? Secret societies recruit from specific backgrounds. Freemasonry, particularly the higher degrees, historically drew membership from established families and professions. Skull and Bones at Yale, Bohemian Club in San Francisco, various Oxford and Cambridge societies, all recruit from elite backgrounds and create networks that persist across generations. Members occupy influential positions in government, business, media, education. They maintain connections, offer mutual support, share information unavailable to outsiders. This isn't supernatural conspiracy. It's network effects. People help those they know, trust those from similar backgrounds, promote those who seem like them. But networks established over centuries, recruiting from bloodlines that trace to ancient sources, would naturally maintain patterns established originally, while participants believe they're simply recognizing merit and maintaining standards. The biological advantages wouldn't need to be dramatic. Slightly enhanced cognitive processing, perhaps a few extra IQ points on average, marginally better health, extending productive lifespan by a few years, improved stress response, allowing better performance under pressure, statistical increase in producing capable offspring. These advantages would be subtle, easily attributed to superior education, better nutrition, privileged upbringing, but compounded across 30 generations, approximately 600 years. Certain families consistently producing capable individuals who rise to influential positions regardless of political upheaval, economic change, or geographic dispersal. The families don't control everything through conscious conspiracy. They're simply positioned advantageously through accumulated benefits of genetic and institutional inheritance, operating within systems designed originally to favor their bloodlines. The Anunnaki wouldn't need to maintain direct involvement if they'd embedded such advantages initially. The system would run itself. Hybrid bloodlines would naturally gravitate to positions of power and influence through genuine capability enhanced by genetic advantages. They would intermarry, concentrating traits while expanding networks. They would create institutions that served their interests while believing they served universal principles. Over millennia, the specific origin would be forgotten, but the pattern would persist. Certain families occupying crucial positions, maintaining influence across changing circumstances, preserving knowledge and connections that set them apart from general population. Not through supernatural power or conscious conspiracy, but through compounding advantages established thousands of years ago and carefully maintained through strategic breeding and institutional positioning. So, what are we actually looking at? Mainstream archaeology dismisses the ancient astronaut interpretation completely, arguing that all these patterns can be explained through normal cultural development, mythological thinking, and later embellishment of historical figures. The texts are mythology, the bloodlines are social constructs, the genetic anomalies are misinterpreted or overstated, the similarities across cultures result from parallel development or ancient trade contact. This explanation requires no extraordinary claims. Humans created civilization gradually, invented gods to explain natural phenomena, and preserved garbled historical memories through religious narratives. The alternative requires us to consider something far stranger: that the texts mean what they say, that beings with advanced capability did intervene in human development, that they established systems designed to persist across millennia, and that evidence of this intervention remains visible if you know where to look and what you're looking at. The truth probably lives somewhere uncomfortable. The texts preserve real historical memory of something that happened, but our framework for interpreting what that something was remains limited by assumptions about what's possible. Whether the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial visitors, time-displaced human civilizations, interdimensional entities, or simply an advanced human culture that preceded and survived cataclysm, the pattern suggests intervention happened and its effects never fully ended. We might still be living inside a system designed millennia ago, following patterns established by beings whose purpose we've forgotten but whose influence continues to shape human development in ways we mistake for natural. The conventional explanation has considerable strength. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We see connections where none exist. Ancient people lacked scientific understanding and attributed natural phenomena to divine action. They exaggerated the achievements of earlier rulers, creating legends of superhuman capabilities. Similar problems across different cultures produce similar solutions independently. Civilization developed gradually as populations grew and challenges required coordination. The genetic anomalies we find are simply features of evolution we don't yet fully understand. The similarities in mythology result from universal human psychology and ancient trade connections that spread ideas. This explanation is parsimonious. It requires no extraordinary assumptions. It fits known human behavior and established scientific principles, but it struggles with specific details. The sudden emergence of sophisticated systems with no development phase. The precision of astronomical knowledge requiring centuries of coordinated observation. The linguistic isolation of Sumerian. The engineering capabilities demonstrated at megalithic sites. The genetic signatures that look engineered rather than evolved. The cross-cultural consistency of specific mythological patterns despite geographic separation and lack of plausible contact. Each individual anomaly can be explained away, but collectively they suggest something more complex than gradual independent development. The alternative explanation requires accepting that beings with capabilities far exceeding contemporary humans intervened in human development. This violates no physical laws. It simply requires that such beings existed and chose to interact with humans, whether they were extraterrestrial, time-displaced human civilization from before a catastrophe, interdimensional entities accessing our reality, or simply an advanced human culture that existed earlier than conventional chronology allows, the intervention itself is plausible if such beings existed. The genetic modification they describe is within reach of our current biotechnology. The social engineering they implemented is sophisticated but understandable. The long-term planning they exhibited is consistent with beings who lived far longer than normal humans. The uncomfortable middle ground suggests the texts preserve real historical memory of something that happened, but our categories for understanding what happened remain inadequate. Something intervened, something taught, something established systems, something withdrew but maintained influence. The Sumerian texts aren't simple mythology. They're too specific, too consistent, too boring in places where mythology would dramatize. They read like administrative records because they probably are administrative records, describing real events in real terms available to the scribes who recorded them. Whether the Anunnaki were exactly what the texts describe, or whether the text described something real using the only conceptual vocabulary available, the pattern suggests human development included intervention from some source, with capabilities we haven't accounted for in conventional models. We might still be living inside the system they designed. The institutions, the power structures, the knowledge hierarchies, the social patterns that feel natural and inevitable might actually be artificial constructs established millennia ago and maintained through institutional inertia and embedded advantages. Most people operating within the system have no idea of its origins. They follow protocols that make sense locally without understanding the global design. They maintain structures because deviation seems risky or impractical. They promote individuals who fit certain profiles because those individuals seem naturally suited for leadership. The system runs itself as it was designed to do, allowing the Anunnaki, if they still exist, to maintain influence without requiring visibility or constant intervention. And we mistake the system's functioning for human nature, believing these patterns emerged naturally when they might have been established deliberately by beings whose timescales and purposes we barely comprehend.